Imagine a single, dedicated mind, perfectly recalling every secret whispered in the Vatican, every tremor of doubt felt in a royal court, and every forbidden ledger entry in the banks of Europe. Now, imagine 100 such minds linked by a system so disciplined, so rigorously guarded, that it functioned as a living, human supercomputer, the ultimate engine of global espionage and ideological control. This is the profound, dark secret of the Jesuit Order. Their true power was not their universities, nor their missions, but a psychological technology so powerful it was deemed an act of moral betrayal. They developed a mnemonic total recall system that allowed them to internalize, cross-reference, and flawlessly retrieve every piece of political, religious, and economic intelligence across Europe, rendering them virtually omniscient. This technique was never meant to be a simple study tool. It was an apparatus of total information control. It granted them the absolute, corrupting power to move popes and manipulate kings, all while presenting a facade of pious devotion and rigorous scholarship. The very foundation of their influence was built upon this vast, unseen, and perfectly recalled lie that this is the truth the Church buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now let us turn back the pages of the years, peeling away the gilded layers of the Renaissance and the tumultuous era of the Counter-Reformation. The flickering candlelight is soft. The air is heavy with the scent of aged parchment and beeswax, and the great city of Rome sleeps, unaware of the silent, perfect minds observing it. We must move slowly, following the delicate trail of whispers and ciphers left by the architects of this intellectual conquest. The chamber is quiet, the hour is late, and the history we seek lies not in stone or ink, but within the subtle, terrifying architecture of the human mind itself. Our journey begins not with a grand revelation, but with a simple, profound necessity, the need to know. The 16th century was an age of chaotic knowledge, a deluge of new ideas, heresies, and political shifts. The recently founded Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, faced the overwhelming task of not only defending the Catholic faith, but mastering the new, complex landscape of the globe. Their founder, a man of iron will and relentless spiritual discipline, St. Ignatius of Loyola, understood that true defense lay not in the strength of arms, but in the perfection of information. Ignatius was a military man turned ascetic, and he brought a soldier's obsession with strategy, order, and absolute efficiency to the realm of the soul and the mind. He saw the chaos of the time as an opponent to be studied, memorized, and outmaneuvered. He demanded of his elite corps of priests and scholars an intellectual precision that bordered on the inhuman, a discipline that required, first and foremost, unbreakable memory. This was the intellectual soil from which the forbidden system was first grown. It began innocently enough, rooted in the ancient, respected art of mnemonics, the memory techniques first formalized by the Greeks. But the Jesuits were not satisfied with simple retention. They sought total recall, an organized, instantaneous access to every detail, every face, every conversation they had ever encountered in their sprawling global network. The system was refined over decades in the quiet, secluded halls of the Roman College, which served as the intellectual headquarters of the order. The core mechanism was the mnemonic palace, a technique known for centuries where one mentally constructs an elaborate building, a palace, a library, a cathedral, and places memories, as symbols or vivid images, within its rooms, hallways, and gardens. But the Jesuit system added a layer of profound, terrifying complexity. Their palace was not individual, it was collective. Every elite member, every perfect memory brother, was trained to build an identical, standardized mental structure. The blueprint of this palace was the same: the number of rooms, the order of the architecture, the specific symbols used to represent major political figures, theological concepts, and financial flows. This standardization meant that when a Jesuit from Paris transmitted information to a Jesuit in Goa, they were essentially plugging a new, perfectly organized file into a shared mental network. This collective, standardized memory system was the secret architect of the mind. The practical application of this system quickly crossed the line from academic discipline to moral temptation. Consider the implications. One could instantaneously cross-reference the secret political ambitions of the French court, learned through a royal confessor, with the financial vulnerabilities of the banking houses, learned through a merchant missionary, and the theological leanings of the papal curia, learned through a Roman cardinal. The sum of this knowledge was not just intelligence. It was foreknowledge. It gave the order the terrifying ability to predict, preempt, and ultimately manipulate European history. The true forbidden knowledge was not the technique itself, but the realization of the power it granted. Perfect, organized information yields perfect, irresistible control. This is where the moral decay began to set in. The order, driven by a deep conviction that their cause, the defense of the faith, justified any means, began to see the manipulation of earthly power as a divine necessity. The moralists within the order, the quieter men who still saw the virtue in simple faith, raised soft initial objections. They argued that such intellectual omnipotence was too close to the prerogatives of God, that it was a burden on the soul that would inevitably lead to arrogance and cold, calculating detachment, but the machine was already moving, the demand for perfect intelligence from the burgeoning global mission field and the desperate political battlefields of the Counter-Reformation was relentless. The early Jesuit generals, men like Diego Lainez and Everard Mercurian, refined the training process. They created specialized, secret sections within their novitiates dedicated to the mnemonic arts, the elite few chosen for the memory implantation. These candidates were selected not only for intelligence but for exceptional emotional resilience. The psychological demands of the system were immense. Imagine having every conversation, every betrayal, every horror of the age perfectly and instantaneously accessible in your mind. There was no forgetting, no escape. The Jesuits had solved the problem of human memory, but they had also created a profound new psychological vulnerability, the toll of total recall. The training involved long, grueling sessions in secluded rooms within the Ramon College. The chosen candidates would spend months constructing their identical mental palaces, mapping the halls, numbering the rooms, and assigning standardized symbols to every major concept. The dedication was absolute. A portrait of a king was always placed in the Hall of Temporal Power, and its placement, color, and surrounding details carried precise, agreed-upon meaning about his current intentions and alliances. This shared internal architecture meant that the vast, complex state of the world could be communicated between continents not through letters, which were slow and susceptible to interception, but through coded references, a single phrase, or a symbolic gesture that instantly unlocked terabytes of shared, perfect information in the recipient's mind. The code used to transmit the perfect memories was simple to an outsider, yet devastatingly complex to the uninitiated. A letter might casually mention, "The tapestry of the fifth chamber needs repair," which to a Jesuit meant the political structure of the fifth European power, e.g., Spain is showing serious internal flaws that can be exploited. This was the quiet, chilling precision that built the Jesuit dynasty. The order soon realized the true, terrifying consequence of their perfection, the fear of the memory palace collapsing into madness. The human mind, designed for the essential function of forgetting, was being forced into an unnatural state of perpetual, perfect retention. Over time, the constant influx of conflicting, morally complex information began to place an unbearable strain on the practitioners. The lines between the objective, carefully organized facts within the mental palace and their own personal memories began to blur. Some brothers reported vivid, waking hallucinations, seeing the figures and symbols of their mnemonic architecture superimposed onto the real world. A colleague might suddenly appear with the symbolic crown of economic bankruptcy resting on their head. These were not just psychological breakdowns, they were security crises. If a perfect memory brother slipped into madness, the collective knowledge, the engine of the order was compromised. A compromised memory palace was a gaping breach, risking the accidental or forced revelation of centuries of accumulated state secrets. To counter this, the order established an even deeper layer of secrecy and control, detailed in the Papal Bulls that protected the order's secrecy. While many bulls simply confirmed the order's privileges, the secret bulls, issued under discreet pressure from Jesuit-influenced popes, granted them extraordinary internal powers of jurisdiction and secrecy regarding their personnel powers that shielded them from external, even ecclesiastical, investigation into the health and activities of their members. Any Jesuit showing the early signs of mnemonic fatigue, unusual detachment, deep paranoia, or the mixing of public and secret memory was quietly and swiftly recalled to the Roman College. These men were either reassigned to isolated, non-critical positions, or in the most severe cases, placed into a profound, carefully managed seclusion. They're perfect. Rendered safe from outside interrogation by being utterly isolated, this necessity led to the most direct act of cover-up, the systematic destruction of the training manuals, the core texts detailing the standardized architecture of the mnemonic palace. The standardized symbols and the training methodology were never published, never bound in permanent covers. They existed primarily as short-run, hand-copied, and meticulously numbered folios that were required to be burned once a student had internalized the principles. The knowledge was transferred not through open scholarship, but through an exclusive, ritualized apprenticeship, ensuring that the system existed only in the living, guarded minds of the elite few. The Jesuits became living, breathing libraries of forbidden knowledge. They were the ultimate spy masters, diplomats, and confessors, armed with a memory so perfect it allowed them to tailor their counsel, their diplomacy, and their strategy with surgical, devastating accuracy. They knew exactly which button to press, which secret to leverage, and which fear to exploit in every powerful man in Europe. It was the ultimate form of information asymmetry, and it was built on a terrible, cold-blooded ethical choice: the slow poison of this total recall system seeped into the very moral fiber of the order's leadership. If you possess all the facts, if you can perfectly predict the chaotic, sinful behavior of others, does your own sin, the sin of manipulation, become easier to justify? The Jesuit leadership often argued that their actions, while perhaps politically harsh, ultimately served the greater divine good. This was the dark kernel of the moral justification for total information control. The belief that their perfect knowledge made them morally obligated to rule, guide, and even coerce the imperfect, forgetful world. The stories began to surface. though always in whispers of the subtle ways they manipulated diplomacy. Consider a Jesuit negotiator sent to broker a peace treaty between two warring Catholic monarchs. He arrives seemingly modest, his hands clean of political ambition. Yet in his mind he holds the memory of every financial debt, every illicit affair, and every secret military weakness of both kings. He can guide the negotiation not through persuasion, but through the gentle, precise application of known vulnerability. The outcome always favors the cause of the Church. But the method is based on psychological blackmail information leverage applied with a serene, priestly calm. Rival religious orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, grew intensely suspicious. They noticed the unnatural speed of the Jesuit ascent, their inexplicable access to royal ear, and their unnerving ability to anticipate political moves weeks before they happened. This led to the rival order's suspicion and the failed infiltration. Attempts were made to place spies within the Jesuit novitiates, but the rigid, cloistered, and uniquely psychological nature of the memory training made infiltration impossible. The system was its own perfect security measure. You could only pretend to be a Jesuit, but you could not fake the contents of a perfect memory palace. The tension culminated in the most human tragedy of the order, the confession of the brother who could no longer forget. This was not a case of madness, but of deep, irremediable spiritual fatigue. The brother, a master of the system, had spent decades absorbing the dark, cynical reality of European politics, the constant lies, the casual cruelty, the endless tide of human failure. His total recall meant that every sin he had ever confessed, every moral compromise he had ever witnessed, remained perfectly pristine in his mind. Alongside the symbols for his own personal faith, he sought not to reveal secrets, but to confess. The profound emptiness of his own soul, hollowed out by the sheer, unblinking weight of perfect knowledge. He had solved the world's puzzles, but in doing so, he had lost his ability to forget, and thus his ability to forgive either the world or himself. His confession was a devastating testimony to the psychological toll of carrying the world's secrets. The order's response was not punitive, but pitying and terrifyingly practical. They placed him in quiet seclusion, ensuring his tragic, perfect mind could never compromise their mission. The sheer scale and internal logic of the system demanded an architecture, both mental and physical, dedicated to its maintenance. We can reconstruct the basic blueprint of this inner sanctuary through scattered clues left in the journals of sympathetic architects who designed the Jesuit colleges. This is the architecture of the mnemonic palace detailed. The palace was structured in concentric circles of secrecy. The outer ring, open to all, was the college itself, a public symbol of learning. The middle ring was the residential quarters for the professed fathers, their daily lives. But the inner ring, accessible only to the memory elite, housed the mental architecture itself. The grand entrance to the mental palace represented the order's core mission. The Great Hall, the repository of general European political facts. The Hall of Temporal Power contained the symbols for all kings and princes, updated daily by the missionary network. The Library of Theological Disputes meticulously catalogued every heresy and counter-argument. And perhaps most chillingly, the Chamber of Financial Flows detailed the movement of every major gold shipment and every bank loan from Genoa to Antwerp. The rooms were always lit by an imaginary soft light, signifying the clarity of truth, even when the contents were dark and compromising. The key to its perfect function was the unsettling calm of the Jesuit spy, a Jesuit agent, operating in the court of a paranoid prince or within the walls of a Protestant stronghold, did not rely on paper notes. They relied on their perfect internal cross-reference system. They could speak with utter, unflappable sincerity because the facts were not emotions. They were perfectly cataloged data points within their mental structure. They never seemed to remember too much because they knew precisely how much to reveal, the minimum required to achieve their goal. Their work led to a quiet but profound transformation of the European landscape, culminating in the Jesuits' role in the 30 Years' War re-examined. Historians often cite political and religious reasons for that devastating conflict. But the secret truth is that Jesuit intelligence, fueled by the perfect memory system, was instrumental in guiding the Catholic Habsburgs, ensuring key alliances, exposing Protestant weaknesses, and crucially, managing the immense shifting debt required to fund the war effort. The conflict was a terrifying, protracted exercise in statecraft, guided by absolute knowledge. The system even included methods for protection against its own failure, the psychological techniques of memory erasure. These were crude, deliberate, and painful psychological rituals used only in extremis. They involved forcefully replacing a complex symbol with a simple, inert one, turning a detailed image of a crucial alliance into a dull, meaningless gray square. It was a conscious act of intellectual self-mutilation, an admission of defeat against the very chaos they sought to master. These techniques were closely guarded, as they represented the ultimate moral compromise, the purposeful destruction of truth in one's own mind. As the decades passed and the system became institutionalized, the political and moral complexity of their operations grew geometrically. The order became an unstoppable force, yet one hated by the very kings and popes they protected. They were necessary but terrifying. This deep-seated fear and resentment, based on the awareness of the Jesuits' perfect knowledge, led to the external attempts to understand and ultimately destroy the system. This became the search for the lost master key to the system. Kings and rival organizations knew there had to be a master cipher, a foundational text, a single document that revealed the architecture of the mind. Countless spies, inquisitors, and royal agents searched the Ramon College, the Jesuit archives, and their international residences. But they always failed because the master key was not made of paper. It was made of discipline. The key was the collective, standardized mental structure itself, a secret that could not be burned, stolen, or translated. The moral debate, though suppressed, never died. Philosophers, many secretly Jesuit-educated, grappled with the philosophical debate on the ethics of total recall. If a human could achieve cognitive perfection, what was the role of divine grace? If one could predict every moral failure, where was the free will? These questions were the psychological fallout of the order's achievement, leaking into the broader intellectual culture of the Enlightenment. The very age of reason was, in part, a reaction to the chilling, rational perfection demonstrated by the Jesuit network. The final testament to the system's power was the quiet surveillance of European royal courts. Every court had a Jesuit confessor. This confessor was not merely a spiritual advisor. He was the local nexus of the perfect memory machine. Through the absolute secrecy of the confessional, he received the most intimate, vulnerable secrets of the monarch. He cross-referenced this information instantly with the collective data in his mind, the monarch's secret debts, their enemies' hidden movements, the specific moral weakness of a rival minister. He then offered counsel that was always correct, always beneficial to the Church's long-term aims, and always, in its subtlety, a form of psychological and political control. The monarch believed the Jesuit was a man of God. In truth, he was A terminal node in the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus the world had ever known. The candlelit scene of the confessional, often depicted as a moment of piety, was, for the Jesuits, a moment of maximum operational effectiveness. The profound contradiction. Use of a sacred rite for ruthless political gain was the ultimate moral decay. At the heart of the Jesuit century, this perfect memory, though an unmatched source of power, eventually became the very reason for the order's temporary collapse. By the mid-18th century, the accumulation of knowledge had bred a massive political blowback. Monarchs across Europe, France, Spain, Portugal, tired of the unresolved question of how much they truly knew, moved with sudden, coordinated fury. The collective memory had made the order too powerful, too knowledgeable, and thus too dangerous to the absolute power of the kings. The suppression of the Jesuit Order in 1773 was a direct assault on the perfect memory machine. When the papal decree was issued and the colleges were stormed, the first priority of the royal agents was to seize the archives. They expected crates of damning paper evidence, ledgers full of blackmail, and maps of secret tunnels. What they found instead were highly efficient, yet often maddeningly sparse, records. The real archive, the total recall system, could not be seized, because it was dispersed among the hundreds of minds now being arrested or scattered across the globe. The final, soft tragedy of the system lies in the final testament of the Grand Master of Memory among the arrested Jesuits. There must have been one, the oldest, the most disciplined, who held the near-complete original blueprint of the memory system in his mind. In the quiet solitude of his prison cell, he would have experienced the ultimate psychological torture, the final end of the order that his perfect mind had built, with every single detail of the failure instantly, flawlessly available for recall. His testament, whispered to a sympathetic guard or perhaps written in a cipher that remains unbroken, would not have been a political defense, but a profound, desperate reflection on the ethical price paid for such knowledge. Did the perfect memory truly save souls? Or did it simply make the world's misery more perfectly known, leading to greater cynicism and colder governance? The Grand Master knew the future of Europe because he held its past entire in his mind. His last act would have been a silent internal ceremony, the psychological demolition of his palace, scattering the carefully placed symbols of every king, every war and every secret, hoping to render the system harmless. But even in destruction, the idea that true power resides in absolute knowledge would have persisted. The order was later restored, but the total information network was never perfectly rebuilt. The trauma of the suppression, the scattering of the original architects, and the global shift toward secular enlightenment meant that the perfect memory machine was relegated to history, dangerous, forbidden secret that had almost given one order control of the Western world. We are left now, at the end of this quiet, candlelit journey, with the silence of the aftermath. The soft glow of the candle on the empty page is the final image of the cover-up. The royal agents found no smoking gun, no comprehensive master plan, only the empty, immaculate archives of a deeply disciplined organization. The true archive walked away, scattered, or quietly died in prison cells. The secret was perfectly protected by its own nature. It existed only in the minds of the initiates. This history casts a long shadow, informing the legacy of manufactured content in modern times. We now live in an age of total information, yet we struggle with total recall. The Jesuit system was a deliberate, controlled solution to chaos. Today we are overwhelmed by chaos, yet the temptation to create a new, all-knowing system of control remains ever present. Every modern attempt at total intelligence gathering, every powerful entity that seeks to know every transaction and every conversation, is a quiet, secular echo of the mnemonic palace. And so, we must ask the final, lingering question: was the great memory a blessing or a curse? Was it the spiritual defense of Europe, or was it the engine of its most subtle, cynical manipulation? The answer lies in the psychological void left by the perfect knowledge. The Order achieved their goal. They possessed a memory that could not forget the sins of the world. But in doing so, they created a machine that could never achieve the simple, human grace of oblivion. The greatest betrayal was not of a king, but of the Order's own soul. They conquered the mind, but perhaps they lost the heart. The chamber grows still darker now. The perfect, remembered facts fade into the soft darkness. But the question of how much control we allow others to have over our own, memory over our own knowledge, is the one that remains perfectly pristine in the quiet of this late hour. As we move toward rest, we must prepare to explore the next quiet mystery. We must now trace the footsteps of the founder himself and understand the Ignatius Loyola and the obsession with information warfare. Every great organization has a dark, hidden blueprint, a core principle so ruthlessly effective that it must be masked by noble intent. For the founder of the Jesuit Order, Ignatius of Loyola, that principle was stark and unyielding. Faith is a battlefield, and victory demands total, systematic information warfare. His celebrated spiritual exercises were not merely prayers. They were a forbidden form of psychological conditioning, designed to forge minds capable of holding, processing, and weaponizing the most profound secrets of European power. Ignatius was not just a saint. He was the first master strategist of the age of information. He saw the world not as a vineyard, but as a map of vulnerabilities. His obsessive focus on perfect intelligence, who owed whom, who sinned where, and who believed what, was the buried lie that transformed a small band of priests into the most formidable shadow government the world had ever known. His spiritual genius was, in truth, a terrifying, unparalleled talent for global control through absolute knowledge. This is the betrayal at the root of their discipline. This is the truth the Church buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We drift back to the 16th century, to the very moment Europe splintered under the weight of the Reformation. The world was a vast, confusing array of shifting loyalties and dangerous new ideas. To understand the obsession of Ignatius, we must first understand the chaos he was determined to conquer. This is not the story of a mystic, but of a general, meticulously planning the conquest of the human soul. The man who became St. Ignatius began his life as Inigo Lopez de Loyola, a Basque nobleman and soldier. He was a creature of the battlefield, valuing tactical precision, hierarchical obedience, and above all, intelligence. His transformation, famously sparked by a devastating cannonball injury at the siege of Pamplona, is often narrated as a purely spiritual awakening, a conversion from worldly ambition to divine service. But the psychological truth is more complex and far more chilling. His physical injury stripped him of the ability to wage conventional war, but it left his military mind intact, merely redirecting its immense energy toward a new, larger, more existential conflict: the preservation of the Catholic Church against the Protestant tide. Ignatius did not abandon strategy. He simply sublimated it into spirituality. He replaced the siege of a castle with the siege of the human mind. This military past is the key to understanding his obsession with information warfare. For Ignatius, the loss of any soul, any state, or any piece of territory to the Protestant movement was a catastrophic intelligence failure. The enemy, he reasoned, was not merely theological. It was organizational, political, and psychological. To win, his soldiers, his priests needed not just piety, but perfect situational awareness. He realized early that the traditional, cloistered monasteries and universities of the time were too slow, too resistant to change, and too lacking in a centralized nervous system to effectively combat the rapid spread of new ideas via the printing press and new political alliances. He envisioned an order that was the antithesis of the static monastery, a mobile, highly educated, fiercely loyal, and globally connected intelligence network. This vision demanded a specific kind of soldier, one who was a scholar, a diplomat, a confessor, and an operative, all housed in a single, utterly disciplined mind. He demanded that every Jesuit, regardless of his post, whether teaching in a college in Paris or preaching on a remote mission in India, must act as an information conduit. Every conversation, every detail of local governance, every shift in sentiment had to be recorded, assessed, and transmitted back to the center in Rome. This system was explicitly designed as a form of information asymmetry. The Jesuits would know more about the fragmented world than the world knew about itself. This knowledge was power, but Ignatius framed it not as political power, but as a necessary spiritual armor, means to ensure the salvation of souls by guiding imperfect temporal rulers toward the correct path. This subtle shift in justification was the first defining act of moral decay. He legitimized the use of absolute intelligence for absolute control. The practical application of this obsession is most clearly seen in the core document of the order, the Constitutions. While appearing to be a rule book for religious life, the Constitutions were, in fact, a revolutionary charter for an intelligence organization. They laid out the framework for what we would now call a centralized, hierarchical command structure designed for maximum information flow and operational speed. The General Superior, Ignatius himself and his successors, was granted nearly absolute authority. But this authority was predicated on a guarantee, perfect and constant information flow. Every Jesuit everywhere was obligated to report regularly and in detail on his activities, his observations, and his judgment of the people and politics surrounding him. These weren't mere letters home. They were intelligence reports, detailed psychological profiles of powerful patrons, analyses of university curricula, and meticulous maps of Protestant strongholds. Consider the revolutionary nature of the Jesuit approach to education. They established colleges not to safeguard old wisdom, but to control the next generation of leadership. By offering free, elite education to the sons of nobles, merchants, and rising officials, they gained access not only to the boys themselves, but to the deepest, most sensitive secrets of their families. The Jesuit professors, armed with the systematic memory techniques described previously, could deduce a family's financial stability, political leanings, and private vulnerabilities simply by observing the behavior and conversations of their sons over years. This placed the Jesuits at the ultimate nexus of power, the confessional and the classroom. In the confessional, they gathered the spiritual secrets of the elite. In the classroom, they gathered the domestic and political secrets of the elite's heirs. The information was always complete, always current, and always moving back to the centralized archive in Rome. This duality was the genius of Ignatius's design, a seamless blend of piety and information warfare. Furthermore, Ignatius built the principle of mobility into the very heart of the order. Unlike monks who were bound to a specific monastery, Jesuits could be dispatched anywhere in the world on a moment's notice. This created an extraordinarily flexible network of observers and agents. A scholar trained in theology could suddenly find himself advising a viceroy in Lima or mediating a political dispute in Prague. This required a constant, deep state of preparedness, which was maintained through the relentless psychological crucible of the spiritual exercises, the exercises. Month-long period of intense meditation and prayer were designed to achieve spiritual perfection. But their secondary function was purely tactical. They were a system of psychological self-mastery. They taught the Jesuit to dissect his own thoughts, control his emotional responses, and submit his will absolutely to the goal of the order. A man who could master his own mind was perfectly prepared to process and leverage the chaotic, emotional information of the world without being corrupted by it. The exercises were the forge that created the cold, precise intelligence operative. The military origin of the Jesuit structure is perhaps most chillingly reflected in the concept of obedience to the general. This obedience was famously absolute, but its true purpose was operational efficiency in information warfare. In a conventional army, the general must trust that his orders will be followed. In the Jesuit network, the general must trust that the information he receives is accurate, comprehensive, and unbiased by the personal feelings of the operative. The vow of total obedience thus became a guarantee of information fidelity. A Jesuit was trained to report only objective fact, devoid of personal judgment or moral commentary, unless explicitly requested. This was crucial for the central command in Rome, which needed to construct a panoramic, unbiased view of the global situation. The operative was a perfect censor, meticulously calibrated to observe and transmit. But this system carried an inherent risk of moral decay. When absolute obedience to the general and the order's goals replaces the individual's conscience, the line between saving souls and seizing power becomes impossibly thin. Ignatius's principle of ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, became, in practice, a justification for any ruthless act, so long as it served the order's strategic goals as determined by the centralized intelligence. Command. We can trace this shift in priority through the order's early documents detailing the establishment of missions. While outwardly focused on conversion, the internal memoranda frequently stress the need to map local power structures, identify resource flows, and understand native vulnerabilities. Classic intelligence gathering repurposed for divine mandate. The mission was dual purpose, saving souls and gathering strategic geopolitical intelligence. One specific, early controversy reveals the depth of the obsession: the handling of secret confessions. The Jesuits were masters of the confessional, and the seal of confession is, of course, sacrosanct. However, Ignatius established protocols to ensure that while the specific content of a secret confession could never be revealed, the general knowledge of a critical vulnerability could be subtly communicated to the general via other means, a coded warning in a regular report, an intentionally ambiguous phrase that unlocked the information in the general's own perfect memory palace. For example, a confessor might not reveal that the king confessed to funding a Protestant plot, but his accompanying report might mention a sudden, unexplained shift in the king's personal spiritual routine, and a recommendation for a specific, seemingly unrelated diplomatic action that preemptively addresses the plot. The general, combining this small piece of data with the vast intelligence network, understood the threat without ever breaching the seal of confession. It was a precise, terrifying dance on the knife's edge of morality. This sophisticated manipulation of information boundaries was the essence of information warfare, turning the most sacred rites of the Church into instruments of political strategy. The intellectual structure that supported this apparatus was the systematic profiling of opponents. Ignatius understood that to defeat the Reformation he had to know the reformers better than they knew themselves. This was not enough to read Luther's works. It was necessary to understand his personality flaws, his financial backers, his emotional vulnerabilities, and the specific psychological needs of his followers. The Jesuit colleges quickly became centers for the study of heresy not as theology, but as psychological pathology. The order's scholars meticulously cataloged Protestant arguments, not just to refute them, but to understand the specific emotional and intellectual hooks that made them appealing to the populace. This deep, cynical understanding of the human mind's need for certainty was then used to craft the Jesuits' own powerful counter-propaganda, tailored precisely to the psychological needs of the local population. The focus was always on the point of failure. Where did the political alliance break down? Where did the merchant's faith waver? Where was the emotional vacuum that Protestantism filled? The answers, perfectly cataloged and recalled, were the weapons in their arsenal, the sheer volume of correspondence required to fuel this engine of intelligence quickly became a challenge. The Jesuit postal network was, for a time, the most reliable and fastest in Europe, surpassing even some Royal Mail services. But the volume demanded a system of rapid synthesis, which is where the perfect memory machine became indispensable. No single person could read, process, and retain the hundreds of reports arriving in Rome each week. But the memory elite, using their shared mnemonic architecture, could instantly assimilate the data, allowing the general to make decisions based on near real-time global intelligence. This is the hidden key. The physical network, the Jesuits themselves, gathered the data, but the internal psychological network, the memory palace, processed and stored it. The general superior was thus the commander of the physical army, but also the CEO of the world's most advanced. Early intelligence firm Ignatius's obsession extended even to the management of time. He understood that speed of information was the ultimate advantage. The Constitution stressed the need for prompt communication and rapid decision-making, a stark contrast to the slow, bureaucratic pace of the Papal Curia. The Jesuit network was designed for agility, allowing them to shift strategy in weeks, while their opponents often took months to even acknowledge a new development. Imagine the psychological effect of this agility on the rival powers. The Jesuit was always one step ahead. His predictions always came true. His counsel was always perfectly timed. This created an aura of near supernatural foresight, which only amplified their authority and control. This perception, while serving their spiritual aims, was, in fact, a carefully manufactured byproduct of superior information warfare. The miraculous was merely the result of perfect data processing. As we examine the legacy of Ignatius, we must confront the unspoken moral cost of total knowledge. The founder's genius lay in his ability to rationalize the pursuit of total information as an act of piety. But what happens to the soul of an organization that systematically eliminates all ambiguity, all doubt, and all personal judgment in favor of the greater glory of God as defined by its central command? The Jesuit Order, in its pursuit of informational perfection, risked eliminating the necessity of faith itself. If every outcome is predictable, if every political chess move is perfectly calculated, and if every human weakness is known, where is the space for providence or human free will? The Order became, in a chilling way, the masters of deterministic history, viewing the world as a complex machine that simply needed the right inputs, information, to produce the desired output. Catholic dominance, this philosophical trap, led to intense internal pressure. The Jesuit General had to constantly manage the brilliance of his operatives. Ensuring their supreme intellectual confidence did not transform into outright hubris. The very act of constantly collecting and leveraging the weaknesses of mankind, the king's vanity, the merchant's greed, the scholar's jealousy, must have, over time, created a profound sense of cynicism within the order's elite. Ignatius instituted safeguards, of course. The emphasis on humility and constant examination of conscience was sincere, but they functioned as psychological containment measures, designed to ensure that the operative remained effective, not necessarily that he remained innocent. The humility was necessary to gain the trust of princes. The self-examination was necessary to prevent madness from the weight. Of all secrets, the historical evidence for this subtle moral decay is seen in the diplomatic incidents of the 17th century, where Jesuit agents, under the cover of papal authority, were often accused by local bishops and secular leaders of acting purely in the strategic interests of the order, often undermining local church authority. They were seen as too worldly, too clever, and too knowledgeable qualities that, while ensuring their success, made them feared and eventually hated. Consider the metaphor of the candle and the shadow. The Jesuit college outwardly shone as a beacon of learning and piety, the candle, but the true operation was conducted in the political, confessional, and intellectual shadows, the shadow, powered by the relentless collection and cross-referencing of every dark human secret. Ignatius provided the philosophical justification for making the shadow the most important part of the operation. This obsession with information warfare ultimately guaranteed the Jesuits' rise to unmatched influence, but also planted the seeds of their inevitable suppression. A ruler can tolerate being advised by a wise man. He cannot tolerate being perfectly known by a wise man. The legacy of Ignatius's military mindset can be found in the subtle language woven throughout the order's earliest correspondences. He often referred to the Protestant movement as the enemy camp and the intellectual battlefield as the campus martis, the Roman field of war. This constant, internalized lexicon of conflict ensured that every educational endeavor, every missionary journey, and every published treatise was understood by the Jesuits not as an academic exercise, but as a tactical operation. This emphasis on the practical rather than the theoretical separated the Jesuit order from every other institution of its time. Their knowledge was not stored on dusty shelves. It was active, mobile, and weaponized. They studied philosophy to understand the weaknesses of logic. They studied rhetoric to perfect persuasion. And they studied human nature to anticipate betrayal. Their education was a curriculum for total situational dominance. The key to their rapid global expansion was the realization that their system of information warfare was just as effective in the jungles of Brazil or the courts of China as it was in the salons of Paris. In a new land, A Jesuit would immediately begin profiling the local ruler, the competing tribes, the flow of trade, and the existing belief system, always seeking the point of leverage, the local vulnerability that could be exploited to introduce Catholicism and establish influence. They were, in essence, the first practitioners of sophisticated, multi-domain intelligence. Gathering on a truly global scale, this relentless drive for information, perfection led to the suppression of competing narratives. Ignatius's system was not just about collecting truth. It was about ensuring that only the Jesuit truth was presented to the powerful. If a rival religious order or a local bishop held information that contradicted the Jesuits' strategic objective, the Jesuit network was deployed to subtly discredit, undermine, or overwhelm that source with superior, verifiable, and highly organized counter-intelligence. It was a quiet campaign of archival and testimonial warfare. Who had better records? Who had more witnesses? Who had a more compelling, comprehensive, and logically flawless narrative? The Jesuit, with his perfect memory palace and his global data stream, always won this contest. This meant that over time, the history presented to the Pope, to the King, and to the powerful banking families was often history curated by the Jesuit intelligence apparatus. The profound, subtle moral corruption was the confidence that they, and only they, possessed the necessary objectivity to determine which truth should live and which should die for the greater glory of God. They became the self-appointed editors of global reality. Let us spend a moment reflecting on the man himself, Ignatius, during the later years of his life. As he aged, directing this global engine from a small room in Rome, his obsession became less about specific battles and more about the perpetuation of the system. He knew that the moment the discipline lapsed, the moment the reports became subjective, or the moment the general lost control of the data, the entire edifice would crumble. His greatest fear was not external attack, but internal intellectual entropy. The system was so vast, so dependent on the perfection of its inputs, that any lapse in discipline could lead to catastrophic errors in political judgment. This fear manifested in his relentless focus on the spiritual perfection of the individual Jesuit, ensuring that personal ambition, moral weakness, or psychological fatigue never compromised the information. Network. The historical consequence of this obsession is the legacy of unmatched discipline. Even centuries after his death, the Jesuit brand remains synonymous with intellectual rigor, strategic depth, and quiet influence. This is the enduring triumph of Ignatius's vision. He engineered an organization whose cultural DNA was permanently imprinted with the principles of information warfare. Every action, from the most mundane teaching assignment to the most complex diplomatic negotiation, retained a strategic purpose. This obsession also created a vacuum of trust. Rulers who relied on the Jesuits, and many did, never fully trusted them. They were too smart, too capable, and too loyal to a higher, unseen power in Rome. The King of France might trust his Jesuit confessor with his soul, but he would never fully trust him with his crown, because the Jesuits mined his perfect memory. Pallas was fundamentally dedicated to the intelligence network of a foreign power. This quiet, chronic mistrust was the unresolved tension of the 17th century. It created a world where political leaders increasingly felt they were playing a rigged game against an invisible, all-knowing opponent. This psychological pressure eventually became unbearable, leading to the coordinated suppression of the order in the following century. The world decided it would rather endure chaos than submit to perfect. Benevolent tyranny. The quiet truth is that Ignatius, the master strategist, may have won every battle of the mind, but his obsession ultimately guaranteed the temporary defeat of the order. By making them too perfectly successful, we conclude our reflection on the founder by looking at the quiet, revolutionary impact his obsession had on the very definition of leadership. Ignatius taught the world that effective leadership in a chaotic age is not about moral superiority alone. It is about absolute intellectual and informational superiority. He was the first to formalize the idea that knowledge, meticulously collected and centrally processed, is the single most powerful tool for global governance. The atmosphere of quiet intrigue that surrounded the Jesuit Order for centuries was a direct result of his methodology. They moved softly, they spoke sparingly, and they achieved their goals through indirection, the hallmark of a successful intelligence operation. The calmness of the Jesuit was the psychological veneer of a man who already knew the outcome, because he had already run the calculations in his head, referencing the entire global data stream contained within his perfect memory palace. As we drift toward the deeper realms of rest, we leave behind the chaotic battlefields of 16th century Europe and the figure of the old soldier turned saint. We acknowledge his genius, but we also feel the chilling weight of his obsession, the absolute conviction that the moral end justifies the informational means. It is a cautionary tale about the seduction of perfect knowledge, a temptation that remains just as potent in our own hyper-connected, data-saturated world. The quiet, hypnotic repetition of Jesuit principles throughout the centuries has left an indelible mark. The awareness that information is power, and perfect information is absolute power. This is the legacy of Ignatius Loyola. The heavy, antique door of the Roman College closes now, leaving us in the quiet. We have seen how the founder's mind established the necessary command structure. Now we must turn our gaze to the physical heart of the operation, the place where the secrets were filed and cross-referenced. We must now explore the secret chamber in the Roman College library, beneath the soaring public grandeur of the Roman College Library, a cathedral dedicated to open scholarship. There existed a forbidden, unseen architecture. This was not a vault for ancient scrolls, but the physical heart of the Jesuits' intelligence operation, a secret chamber, subtly woven into the building's foundations, where the true, dangerous work of the order was conducted. This chamber was the only place where the perfect memory brothers dared to physically transcribe the most profound political, financial, and moral secrets of Europe. It housed the master cipher keys, decoded reports from global agents, and the chilling psychological profiles of Kingsall, documented proof of the order's moral decay and their systemic betrayal of the very trusts they were sworn to uphold. The very stone of this room concealed the lie that the Jesuit order was merely spiritual. It was a temple to absolute information control. Its existence was a curse upon the Church, granting its keepers a power that was meant only for God. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman College. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are in 16th century Rome, standing before the magnificent facade of the Roman College, the intellectual headquarters of the Society of Jesus, while the scholars and students work in the vast, sunlit halls above. Our focus must drift downward, toward the silent, secured spaces. We must seek the hidden door, the precise point of convergence where the world's most sensitive secrets were gathered, synthesized, and transformed into the strategic knowledge that ruled Europe. The Roman College was Ignatius's masterpiece, a massive complex built near the heart of papal power. Outwardly, it served its public function, training elite missionaries, producing theological scholarship, and upholding the banner of the Counter-Reformation. But structurally and organizationally, it was designed as the central processing unit of a global information network. The library was, by design, the highest symbol of the order's intellectual prestige. It was meant to be seen as open, scholarly, and dedicated to the pure pursuit of truth. Yet the Jesuit architects, working under the meticulous, military-minded direction of the General Superior, had included a structural anomaly, a hidden recess within the library's physical framework. This anomaly was the secret chamber. The chamber was located not in a remote wing, but strategically close to the general's private apartments and the main archive, but accessible only by a single, carefully concealed passage. The entrance was often disguised by a massive, built-in wooden bookcase which, when a specific sequence of books was pressed or a hidden mechanism was activated, would silently swing inward. The security was simple, elegant, and relied on discipline and ritual rather than heavy iron locks. Only the general, his immediate secretary, and the handful of perfect memory brothers knew the sequence. The chamber itself was designed for a single purpose: the safe transfer of secrets from mind to matter. Remember, the Jesuit memory system meant the most critical information was stored perfectly in the minds of the operatives. But for operational planning, strategic review, and communication with the general, certain high-level synthesis documents had to be physically recorded. This chamber was the only place this process could occur. The atmosphere within was profoundly different from the library above. The main library was airy and bright. The chamber was small, soundproofed, and lit only by heavy, enclosed oil lamps or small, strategically placed shafts of natural light filtered through thick stonework, a permanent twilight, designed to induce focus and absolute discretion. Here, a Jesuit returning from the court of Spain or the missions in Japan would sit, not to write a public treatise, but to dictate his findings. He would spend hours meticulously translating the mental symbols of his mnemonic palace into ciphered text, transcribing the precise, perfect data he could not risk carrying on his person. The furniture within the chamber was sparse, but highly functional: a heavy oak table, two simple, high-backed chairs, and most critically, a wall of small, meticulously organized drawers and cubbies. These drawers did not hold common books. They held the physical instruments of the intelligence trade. These included the master cipher, keys, small, handwritten codices that contained the constantly changing numerical or linguistic substitutions used to protect the most sensitive global correspondence. It was here that the cryptographic integrity of the entire network was maintained. Every key was unique, every codex was numbered, and their circulation was monitored with obsessive precision. A key was only released to a departing operative, and its return upon their recall was mandatory and immediately verified. But the most compelling items, STORED, within were the ciphered summary reports. These were not the hundreds of letters sent back and forth between Jesuit missions. Those were stored in the regular archives. These were the high-level synthesis documents, the concentrated, data-rich summaries created by the perfect memory brothers. A report might simply be titled Summary of Temporal Affairs, Portugal, 1625, yet contain a chillingly complete breakdown of the royal family's finances, the king's personal moral failings, and the names of every key minister who could be swayed by either debt or devotion. These reports were written on the thinnest vellum, often in minuscule script, to minimize bulk and maximize the efficiency of concealment. The physical act of writing in this chamber was a profound ritual, marking the transition of a secret from the absolute safety of the human mind to the dangerous reality of the physical world. The atmosphere of the chamber, its quiet, sound-dampened air, and the absolute solitude of the operative served to reinforce the ethical weight of the task. The chamber also served as the primary physical meeting place for the inner circle of the memory elite. Here, the few men entrusted with the collective mnemonic palace would gather with the general. They would not speak in detail of their findings. Instead, they would use the internal language of their shared mental architecture, discussing the integrity of the hall of temporal power, or the anomalous symbol in the chamber of financial flows. This allowed for high-speed, secure, and abstract strategic planning that was completely incomprehensible to any accidental eavesdropper. The architecture of the chamber was thus a mirror of the architecture of the mind. It was a space designed for perfect convergence, the silent place where the chaotic, noisy reality of the world was distilled into the quiet, perfect knowledge of the Jesuit Order. The chamber's design incorporated a crucial psychological element, the illusion of secrecy as sanctity. The fact that this room was so hidden, so difficult to access, and so clearly devoted to sensitive tasks led the few who used it to imbue it with an almost religious significance. It was the sanctuary of knowledge, and the secrets transcribed here felt less like political intrigue and more like divine necessity. This subtle psychological framing reinforced the Jesuit principle that their information warfare was undertaken for the greater glory of God, but the physical reality of the chamber told a different, more chilling story, a story of moral decay through documentation. The systematic maintenance of the psychological profiles housed in the cubbies was the most direct evidence of this decay. These were not generic summaries. These were detailed, intimate records of human weakness. They included specific notes on the habits of high-ranking church officials, their vulnerabilities to flattery or ambition, and the exact nature of the leverage the order held over them. These profiles allowed the general to predict, with near-perfect accuracy, how a cardinal would vote, or how a competing religious order might react to a new Jesuit initiative. The collection was a living, growing record of human fallibility, constantly updated by the reports flowing in from every confessional and court in the world. It was a library dedicated not to virtues, but to sins. The importance of the chamber meant that every precaution was taken against discovery, not just by rivals, but by the very authority the Jesuits claimed to serve, the Pope himself. While the Jesuits often enjoyed papal favor, the General Superior maintained a constant military-grade distrust of external oversight. The chamber had a simple yet devastating final safeguard, a small, lead-lined brazier built into the floor under a heavy, hinged flagstone. In the event of an imminent, unscheduled inspection, or worse, a hostile siege, this brazier allowed for the instantaneous, complete destruction of the most sensitive paper documents. The vellum would burn quickly, and the lid lining was designed to contain the smoke and ash, minimizing the chance of discovery from the rooms above. The order understood that the secrets could be reconstructed from the minds of the scattered brothers, but the physical documentation, the proof of the organized conspiracy, had to vanish without a trace. This small, blackened brazier was the true, silent heart of the Jesuit cover-up, a constant, chilling reminder that their work existed outside the bounds of conventional morality and required the perpetual willingness to destroy. all evidence of their methods. The atmosphere within the secret chamber was not just one of secrecy. It was an atmosphere of absolute psychological focus. The men who worked there, the architects of the mind, had to maintain total mental discipline. They were transcribing the perfect knowledge of their internal mnemonic palaces, and any error in transcription could lead to a massive strategic failure miles away. The rhythm of life in the chamber was slow, rhythmic, and methodical. There was no rush, only relentless precision. A Jesuit might spend days on a single summary report, ensuring every coded entry and every cross-reference was flawlessly documented. The only sound was the soft scratching of the quill on the vellum and the rhythmic drip of oil in the Lampa soundtrack of unblinking information warfare. This chamber held the master records for the Jesuits' most ambitious projects. Not merely political maneuverings, but long-term social engineering projects. For instance, the Cubbies would hold documentation relating to the quiet, systemic efforts to influence the curriculum of every major university in Catholic Europe, ensuring that critical thought was guided toward outcomes favorable to the Church. The chamber held the blueprints for controlling the flow of ideas themselves. The records also detailed the Order's highly controversial involvement in global finance. While the Jesuits were not officially bankers, their missions and colleges required vast sums of money, and their global network provided unparalleled insight into trade routes, commodity prices, and currency fluctuations. The chamber contained the ciphers for tracking major gold shipments, the secret ledgers detailing the Order's own immense hidden wealth, and the records of loans made to and often leverage gained over desperate monarchs. This financial documentation was perhaps the most dangerous category of all. Financial power is the most secular of all powers, and the documentation proved that the Jesuit Order, despite its spiritual vows, was operating as a global, commercial, and financial entity, capable of collapsing markets or propping up regimes. Based on the strategic needs of the General. The chamber thus became the material proof of the ultimate moral conflict within the Jesuit Order. The battle between the purity of their spiritual goal and the cynical material ruthlessness of their means. Every piece of paper in that room was evidence of a strategic compromise, an ethical boundary crossed in the name of the greater glory of God. They were playing a worldly game, but using the absolute protection of a religious mandate. The necessity of this physical, secret chamber highlights a crucial limitation of the perfect memory system. While the minds of the Jesuits were the primary archive, the General Superior, as the single point of decision-making, needed a consolidated, instantly reviewable resource. He could not interrogate his entire elite corps daily. The chamber served as his operational command center. It was here that the General would spend long, solitary hours reviewing the synthesized reports, cross-referencing the financial ciphers with the psychological profiles, and marking up the vellum with his strategic decisions that would shape the politics of continents. The chamber's soundproofing and seclusion ensured that this high-stakes process was conducted in absolute security. The silence was essential for strategic thought unpolluted by external noise or influence. One can imagine the General, a man of immense discipline and calculating intellect, sitting at that oak table, surrounded by the physical evidence of the world's chaos, and calmly imposing order through sheer informational superiority. The candle's soft glow on the vellum would illuminate the terrible weight of his responsibility, the burden of holding absolute, hidden knowledge. This is the place where the greatest cover-ups were planned. When a Jesuit mission failed, or when a major strategic error was made, The general would use the chamber to coordinate the response. This included the preparation of official, sanitized versions of events for public consumption, while the true, damning details were filed away in the psychological profiles of the involved parties, a permanent, secret record of every failure and every moral compromise. The Jesuits' global reputation for being perfectly informed was ultimately tied to the efficiency of this one room. Every accurate prediction, every successful diplomatic intervention, every timely warning to a Catholic ruler originated from the synthesis that took place on that simple oak table. The power was disproportionate. One small, hidden room in Rome governed the direction of empires. The threat posed by this room was well understood by the Jesuits' rivals. During periods of heightened tension between the order and local monarchies, the most persistent demand from royal envoys was the right to inspect the Jesuit archives. The Jesuits always resisted, knowing that while the public library held nothing compromising, the discovery of this secret chamber would provide irrefutable physical evidence of their vast intelligence network and their deliberate political manipulation. Their repeated, successful defense of this room was, therefore, one of the greatest feats of sustained information warfare in history. They protected the truth by ensuring that no physical trace of the system could ever be found by hostile hands. The ultimate betrayal of the chamber was its silent contribution to the moral corruption of the order itself. When all the world's secrets are laid bare, documented, and cataloged for strategic use, it becomes easy to view humanity not as a collection of souls to be saved, but as a matrix of vulnerabilities to be managed. The quiet solitude of the secret chamber fostered this cold, strategic detachment. The silence was the sound of ethical distance. The Jesuit, who transcribed the secret confession of a king, detailing his most private sin, was not doing so merely to guide his soul. He was creating a permanent, physical file of leverage for the general. The chamber made this political use of sacred information a routine, bureaucratic function, thereby normalizing the moral decay. The chamber held evidence of projects that verged on the forbiddance. Early attempts to collect and analyze demographic data to predict population shifts and control the narrative of history. They were using the tools of early modern science, but for the most cynical, controlling, and medieval ends. This blending of ruthless strategy with scholarly discipline is the unique, unsettling characteristic of the Jesuit cover-up. When the Jesuit Order was finally suppressed in 1773, the royal agents who stormed the Roman College were instructed to seize all documents and archives. We have historical records of their intense frustration. They found vast, well-organized public libraries and administrative documents, but the smoking gun, the physical proof of the conspiracy, was elusive. This is where the secret chamber's final act of cover-up took place. In the crucial hours between the decree of suppression and the arrival of the king's troops, the general's closest aides would have swiftly enacted the final protocol. The most sensitive documents, the master cipher keys, the psychological profiles of the reigning monarchs, the secret financial ledgers would have been tossed into that small, lead-lined brazier and reduced to ash. What the agents found later, if they found the chamber at all, was a clean, empty room with a strange, blackened fixture in the floor. The room, therefore, did its job perfectly. It kept the secrets for over 2 centuries. And then, in the final moment of crisis, it destroyed the physical proof, forcing their enemies to rely only on circumstantial evidence and the unreliable testimonies of captured individuals. The real archive, the human mind, was dispersed. and the physical archive was incinerated. We are left with the ghost of the room, a quiet, unseen space where the fate of Europe was decided. The idea of the hidden room persists in the architecture of power, the realization that the most dangerous decisions are never made in the grand public halls, but in the small, sealed, soundproofed spaces where information is raw and leverage is total. The chamber represents the ethical frontier of information management. It forces us to ask, at what point does meticulous record-keeping become malicious profiling? At what point does strategic silence become outright lying? The Jesuits, guided by Ignatius's military philosophy, consciously stepped over that line, arguing that the divine goal purified the wicked means. As we look toward rest, we carry the image of that small, silent room. The oak table, the unused chairs, the subtle mechanism of the hidden door, and the chilling presence of the empty brazier. It is a monument to the chilling power of organized knowledge and the persistent temptation of the powerful to create a reality known only to themselves. The legacy of the secret chamber is the quiet assurance that, even today, there are always rooms hidden within the walls of power rooms where the true, unsanitized facts of our world are quietly filed, coded, and cross-referenced, far from the public gaze. The architectural betrayal of the library still whispers its lesson: the greater the light, the deeper the hidden shadow. We have seen the physical convergence of the secrets. Now, we must turn to the essential components of the system itself, the human element. We must understand the profound discipline required to carry this entire burden. Our journey continues with the few who were called to uphold this system. As we explore the elite few chosen for the memory implantation, the greatest secret of the Jesuit Order was not a document, nor a hidden chamber, but a specific type of human being, the elite few chosen for the memory implantation. These men were subjected to a forbidden psychological and mnemonic conditioning so profound, it fundamentally altered their ability to perceive and retain reality. They were selected for their intellectual brilliance, but also for a rare, chilling emotional detachment, the capacity to carry the weight of the world's sins without suffering spiritual or mental collapse. The implantation was the final, irreversible step, transforming a dedicated scholar into a living archive of absolute power. This process was the ultimate betrayal of scholarly ethics, turning the human mind into a ruthlessly efficient, cynical instrument of information warfare. To be chosen was the highest honor, yet the deepest curse, guaranteeing a life of perfect memory and perpetual moral loneliness. They were the most powerful men in Europe, yet their minds were never truly their own. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are seeking the truth within the rigorous, silent halls of the Jesuit novitiate, far from the public eye. Our gaze must fall upon the young men, the novices who were deemed worthy, or perhaps tragically suited for this ultimate task. We watch their selection, a process as precise and cold as a mathematical formula, designed to identify the few capable of bearing the unimaginable burden of total recall. The selection process for the memory elite, the men destined to become the human nerve center of the Jesuit information machine, was a multi-year, highly secretive process conducted within the novitiates and juniораtes across the Jesuit network. It was not enough to be brilliant. Academic excellence was the baseline. The General Superior's office sought a confluence of specific, rare traits. Firstly, they required absolute intellectual capacity. The candidate needed a natural memory capable of the initial retention of complex, multilingual data. They had to be masters of dialectic, philosophy, and mathematics, capable of rapid abstraction and lateral thinking. The mnemonic system required the ability to construct the vast, standardized palace of memory, and only the most rigorously intelligent minds could sustain such complex internal architecture. Secondly, and more critically, they sought profound emotional discipline. The biggest danger to the perfect memory system was not external sabotage, but internal collapse. A mind that perfectly recalls every sin, every betrayal, and every horror reported from the global network is a mind highly susceptible to madness, profound cynicism, or despair. The chosen few had to demonstrate an unnerving ability to separate objective fact from subjective emotional response at cold. Analytical clarity that allowed them to process the world's misery as mere data points. This detachment was tested throughout the early years of formation, often through subtle psychological means. The novice would be exposed to morally ambiguous situations, required to report with absolute objectivity on the failures of his peers, or forced to study the most devastating historical tragedies while maintaining perfect, serene composure. The goal was to eliminate all sentimentality, replacing it with the calm, efficient logic of the strategist. The third required trait was unquestioning loyalty to the hierarchy. Since the knowledge they carried was a potential world-ending secret, their allegiance could not waver. The long, grueling process of the spiritual exercises served as the ultimate test of this loyalty, forging a will that was entirely subordinate to the general's will, ensuring that the memory, once implanted, served the collective strategic goal of the order alone, only after a candidate had successfully passed this three-pronged psychological and intellectual scrutiny was he introduced to the deepest, most guarded secret, the initial blueprint of the mnemonic palace. The introduction to the secret was not a revelation of hidden texts, but an initiation into a new way of thinking, a process that became known internally as the memory implantation. This phrase was used because the training was less about learning a technique and more about structurally rewriting the architecture of the subject's own mind to conform to the order standardized model the training took. Place in isolated cells or the deepest recesses of the novitiate, often conducted by an older, revered memory brother, a living, breathing exemplar of the system. The first step was the meticulous, standardized construction of the shared mental palace. This was a multi-month ordeal where the novice had to mentally build, room by room, an identical internal structure to the one carried by every other. Operative in the network, every detail mattered. The color of the imaginary velvet curtains in the hall of temporal power, the precise number of steps leading to the chamber of financial flows, the exact placement of the symbol for papal authority. This standardization was the technical core of the system, ensuring that when two Jesuits spoke in code, they were literally referencing the same coordinates within the same internal architecture. The symbolic system was the true, forbidden knowledge shared only among the elite. A simple, carved ivory bust always represented the King of Spain. A specific pattern of interlocking rings always represented a major financial network like the Fuggers. These symbols were dense with meaning, designed to instantly unlock vast amounts of perfectly indexed data. Learning the system was like learning a new, incredibly precise internal language, the language of total intelligence. The psychological impact was profound. The novice had to dedicate so much intellectual energy to building and maintaining this artificial, complex internal world that his personal, spontaneous memory began to recede. His mind became less his own and more a perfectly calibrated instrument of the order. The goal was not to have a good memory, but to be the memory. This process demanded the complete submission of the individual's cognitive autonomy. It was an ultimate act of intellectual servitude veiled in the language of spiritual discipline. The Jesuit was trained not to think for himself, but to think as the network. His perfect memory was a shared resource, always available for the strategic use of the general. This created a specific, chilling identity for the elite few. They were the most informed individuals in the world. Yet they were also the most emotionally and intellectually detached. They lived in a perpetual twilight of classified information, unable to share their knowledge with the outside world and often unable to form deep, personal bonds because their minds were already occupied by the vast, cold, perfect knowledge of global political, financial, and moral secrets. The training was not static. It involved perpetual, intense drills in information cross-referencing. Imagine 2 or 3 of the chosen novices seated in the dark, silent chamber. The elder brother would read a seemingly random string of facts, a political observation from Poland, a market fluctuation in Antwerp, and a theological dispute in Paris. The novices would then have to instantly internalize these facts, assign them to their proper coded symbols, and file them into the precise locations within their mental palaces. But the true test was the cross-reference. They would then be asked immediately to state the strategic implication of these 3 disparate facts when placed next to the existing memory files regarding the Habsburg debt. This required instant synthetic analysis, the kind of rapid, high-stakes computation that defined the order's strategic advantage. The goal of the drilling was to achieve informational automation. The Jesuit should not have to consciously search his memory. The relevant information should simply appear, cross-referenced and synthesized, as a perfect, unblinking truth. This level of automation is what allowed a Jesuit confessor in a royal court to appear to give impromptu, deeply profound advice that was, in reality, the product of a massive, pre-processed global intelligence stream. The psychological layer of this mastery was the creation of the moral buffer. These men, through conditioning, built a thick, intellectual barrier between the terrible nature of the information they carried, treason, murder, heresy, financial ruin, and their own spiritual core. They viewed the secrets they held not as moral failures, but as strategic variables. The king's adultery was not a sin to be judged by the operative. It was merely a symbol filed in the vulnerability wing of the Hall of Temporal Power, a variable to be used in the general's equation for global influence. This detachment, while tactically brilliant, was the primary source of moral decay. It transformed the priest into a perfect analyst, but at the cost of the simple emotional empathy required for genuine spiritual leadership. They were the most informed counselors, yet perhaps the least human men in Europe. The final initiation into the elite few was the oath of total silence. This was an oath far stricter than the common vows taken by Jesuit priests. It was a vow never under threat of death or excommunication, to reveal the architecture of the mnemonic palace, the standardized symbols, or the list of other members of the memory elite. This oath was necessary because the collective nature of the memory meant that revealing one part was equivalent to compromising the entire global network. Their vow of silence was, quite literally, the firewall protecting the Jesuit empire. The consequences of being chosen were deeply personal and existential. The elite few carried an invisible burden that separated them profoundly from their peers. They were isolated by their knowledge and their necessary psychological detachment. They were constantly on guard, knowing that any slip, any moment of personal weakness, could expose the entire apparatus and compromise the strategic direction of the church. Their deployment was strategic and highly monitored. They were placed in key positions across the globe, as confessors to emperors, as advisors to viceroys, as the rectors of the most important colleges, and as the leaders of remote, strategically critical missions. Their location was never accidental. It was dictated by the network's need for a high-level, perfectly informed operative at a critical information node. The general superior maintained a constant, rigorous system of internal monitoring. Through coded communication, the general would frequently test the mental acuity and psychological stability of the memory elite. He would send ambiguous questions or intentionally corrupted data points, requiring the operative to instantly reference their palace and correct the error, proving their memory remained perfect and their mind stable. This internal monitoring was the ultimate safeguard against the fear of the memory palace collapsing into madness. The greatest threat to their sanity was the accumulation of moral horror. The memory elite held the perfect, pristine record of every political execution, every financial ruin, every act of religious persecution, and every cynical betrayal across the continent. While their moral buffer allowed them to treat this information as data, the sheer weight of it, the constant presence of human darkness in their minds, was an immense psychological toll. They lacked the human gift of oblivion, the ability to forget the necessary cruelty of the world. This leads us to the quiet tragedy of the unspoken moral cost. Did these men, in achieving informational perfection, lose the capacity for simple human faith? When you know the exact, cynical mechanism by which every miracle or political success was engineered, does your own belief in providence waver? This profound internal wrestling match was the true, forbidden psychological price of the memory implantation. They were the most perfectly informed religious men in the world. Yet they may have been the ones closest to a purely secular, deterministic view of history, a worldview based on the terrifying precision of human knowledge, rather than the chaotic grace of God. Their very existence was a quiet philosophical contradiction at the heart of the Counter-Reformation. The ultimate test of the elite few came during the suppression of the Jesuit Order in the 18th century. When kings and popes finally moved against the order, the memory elite were specifically targeted. They were imprisoned, interrogated, and pressured to reveal the order's secrets. This is where the psychological conditioning of the memory implantation proved its final, chilling success. While some lower-level Jesuits broke under pressure, the memory elite, with their perfected emotional discipline and absolute mental control, remained silent regarding the core architecture of the system. Their minds, trained to withstand the psychological chaos of the world, were perfectly equipped to withstand the psychological terror of interrogation. They could truthfully say they had no physical documents, no written ciphers to betray, because the vital information was housed in the perfect internal sanctuary of their minds. Their silence was not merely an act of defiance. It was the final, devastating proof that Ignatius's design had succeeded. He had created an archive that could not be burned, seized, or tortured into confession. The scattered survivors of the memory elite, living in quiet exile after the suppression, carried the unresolved burden of the complete, perfect history of the order within them. They were the living libraries of a suppressed empire, their memories the only remaining evidence of the most sophisticated intelligence organization of the age. As we look toward rest, We consider the profound sacrifice made by these men. They traded the chaos and spontaneity of a normal mind for the calm, terrible precision of the perfect archive. They mastered the world's secrets, but they had to renounce their own internal freedom to do so. They were the architects of control, yet they were themselves the most rigidly controlled subjects of the entire Jesuit system. The image of the Jesuit, serene and silent under pressure, is the enduring symbol of this psychological cover dash-up. We have explored the selection and the burden of the elite few. Now, we must examine the specific threat that made this system a necessity, the overwhelming fear that drove the need for total control. Our journey continues with the psychological toll that necessitated this system. As we turn our focus to the psychological toll of carrying the world's secrets, imagine a mind that cannot forget a vast internal palace where every political betrayal, every intimate confession, and every detail of human moral decay is perfectly filed, instantly recallable and perpetually present. This was the terrifying reality for the Jesuits' elite few, the architects of the perfect memory machine. Their minds were not just archives. They were prisons of absolute knowledge. The true curse of this forbidden system was the psychological toll of carrying the world's sins without the natural, human release of oblivion. They were trained to process tragedy as data, but the sheer, cumulative weight of global deceit and cruelty led to profound isolation, crippling cynicism, and for some, a silent, terrifying form of madness, a lie they had to hide even from their own general. Their perfect memory ensured the Order's triumph, but at the cost of the individual soul's serenity. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move past the strategic calculations and the coded ciphers, seeking the soft, dark corners of the human heart that lay beneath the Jesuits' iron discipline. This is a story about the silence after the strategy is complete, the heavy, internal quietude that settles on a mind saturated with the world's perfect, unblinking truth. The most profound difficulty for the elite few began long after the arduous training was complete. It was the crushing reality of informational saturation. The human mind is designed with a profound, essential function: to forget the unnecessary, to dull the edges of trauma, and to allow the past to gently fade into narrative rather than remain pristine, instantaneous fact. The perfect memory system surgically removed this function. The Jesuit operative was forced into a state of perpetual awareness. Every piece of intelligence, the King of Spain's private financial desperation, the exact moment a merchant family began to plot treason, the precise detail of a plague outbreak in a distant port was perfectly indexed and instantly available. There was no escape into the comfortable fog of ignorance or the soothing distance of time. This led to the core psychological toll, the loss of oblivion. Think of the simple moral relief of forgetting a harsh word spoken in anger, or the necessary distance gained from a loved one's illness. The Jesuit could not have this. His memory was a flawless mirror, constantly reflecting the complete sum of human weakness. This meant his mind was never truly empty, never truly restful. Even in prayer, the vast, meticulous architecture of the mnemonic palace was perpetually humming, indexing and cross-referencing. The consequence was a profound sense of psychological isolation. The memory elite could never fully relate to their peers or to the outside world. They knew the complete, unvarnished truth about everyone: the Pope's political calculation, the patron's secret debts, the student's hidden heresy, They lived behind a veil of total knowledge, making simple, human connection based on shared, imperfect knowledge virtually impossible. They were the most informed men in Europe, yet also the most profoundly lonely. This isolation was not merely a personal hardship. It was a systemic risk. It contributed to the second major toll. Crippling cynicism. The Jesuit operative was trained to be a master analyst of human behavior. He saw the world not through the lens of faith alone, but through the perfect data stream detailing mankind's predictable flaws. The constant review of strategic failures, moral lapses, and political self-interest, all cataloged perfectly, led to a deep, often subconscious cynicism about the possibility of genuine virtue or selfless action. In the confessional, the Jesuit heard the sins of the great and the small. In his mind, he instantly cross-referenced the confessed spiritual failure with the external political and financial data. He saw that the moment of spiritual weakness was almost always followed by a strategically predictable political move. This synthesis, while invaluable for the general, slowly eroded the operative's belief in the transcendent power of the soul, favoring instead a deterministic, cold view of human nature. This cynicism was the quiet moral decay of the individual priest. He still executed his duties perfectly, he still preached, he still advised, he still taught, but the internal fire of simple, trusting faith was often replaced by the cold, clear light of informational certainty. He knew why people acted, and the reason was almost always tied to self-interest or manipulation, which made the chaos of the world predictable, but no less tragic. The Jesuit General was keenly aware of this internal danger. The order's emphasis on constant self-examination and humility was, in part, a psychological containment measure designed to combat this cynicism. The operative had to be constantly reminded that while he saw the world's sins, he was not himself immune to pride, the sin of the intellect. This created an internal tension. The intellectual pride required to maintain the perfect memory against the spiritual humility demanded by the order. The constant tension between perfect data and imperfect faith was a spiritual crucible unique to the memory. Elite. The toll eventually manifested physically. Reports, scattered and coded, speak of the mnemonic fatigue, not simple exhaustion, but a profound, deep-seated weariness of the mind. These men suffered from chronic insomnia, as their internal palace never truly closed down. Their minds continued to cross-reference and process data even during attempts at sleep, leading to a constant state of low-grade informational anxiety. The world's secrets were not just in their heads. They were actively eroding their ability to rest. The most terrifying manifestation of the psychological toll was the onset of the mnemonic delusion, a rare yet devastating form of mental breakdown observed in the most saturated members of the elite few. This breakdown occurred when the strict boundary between the internal, coded world of the mnemonic palace and external, objective reality began to dissolve. The Jesuit had spent so long perfectly indexing reality with symbols that the symbols themselves began to replace reality. Imagine a Jesuit looking at a high-ranking court official. In his perfectly trained mind, he sees the official's face, but superimposed upon it is the coded symbol for high risk of treason and the colored index for leverage, financial debt. When the breakdown occurred, the Jesuit could no longer suppress the internal symbols. He would see the treason index physically hovering over the man's head. He would perceive a seemingly innocent diplomatic message, and his mind, overwhelmed, would project the entire associated network of betrayal and hidden meaning onto the words themselves, causing him to react with extreme paranoia or inappropriate aggression. The world, for him, became a suffocating, perfectly transparent mechanism of deceit, with no room for chance or innocence. The General's office, acutely aware of the threat posed by a compromised mind that held all secrets, had strict protocols for dealing with mnemonic delusion. The brother was never publicly disgraced or hospitalized, as that would expose the system. Instead, he was recalled to the Roman college and placed into a specialized, guarded seclusion, a kind of honorable confinement. His perfect mind was now a ticking time bomb of world secrets. The Order solution was to essentially turn the key on the archive, isolating the Jesuit completely from all information sources and all communication, hoping that total stasis would contain the psychological damage. It was a cold, pragmatic act of preservation, prioritizing the safety of the information network over the health of the individual. The records of these confined brothers, if they existed, would be the most heartbreaking testimony to the moral corruption of the system. These men, who sacrificed their personal freedom and sanity for the Order's strategic success, ended their lives in silence, imprisoned by the very perfection of their own memory, victims of their own absolute knowledge. The constant internal tension also severely impacted the personal piety of the memory elite. How does one pray sincerely for the soul of a monarch when one holds the perfect, unblinking record of that monarch's deliberate, cynical acts of cruelty and calculated betrayal? The Jesuit was required to maintain the outward appearance of unwavering faith and hope, but internally his reality was governed by informational determinism. This forced dichotomy led to a specific form of spiritual detachment, a quiet, pervasive sense of spiritual emptiness. They mastered the techniques of faith, but struggled with the simple, vulnerable act of belief. This psychological toll was amplified by the necessity of total operational silence. The memory elite could never share their burden, even with their closest spiritual director or colleagues outside the inner circle. The secret was too big, too dangerous, and too integrated into the system's function. They could not confess the true depth of the cynical information they carried, nor the psychological strain it caused, without committing the ultimate act of betrayal against the Order. They were forced into a role of being the world's most informed confidants, yet having no confidant of their own. They became masters of listening, but were utterly forbidden from truly speaking the truth that consumed them. This enforced silence was, perhaps, the most insidious form of psychological torture built into the system. The records of the time hint at the consequences through the Jesuits' use of palliative disciplines. The elite few often engaged in extreme forms of asceticism, fasting, long vigils, and intense penances, not always out of spiritual fervor, but as a desperate, subconscious attempt to use physical pain to distract the mind from the endless, suffocating flow of mental information. The pain was real, immediate, and simple. The knowledge was complex, perpetual, and corrupting. They sought physical simplicity to counter intellectual chaos. This reliance on extreme discipline highlights the true nature of the system. It was a structure built on the systematic suppression of human need. The Jesuits' body and soul were forced into servitude to the perfect memory, sacrificing serenity, personal trust, and even sleep, all for the strategic perfection of the Order's information warfare. As we close our reflection on this profound psychological burden, we return to the quiet image of the memory elite in their later years. Those who did not succumb to mnemonic delusion or physical exhaustion became the quiet, unflappable pillars of the Order, men of legendary calm and wisdom. But their calm was not peace. It was perfect control, Their faces, visible in early portraits, often exhibit an unnerving serenity, a deep-set composure that is almost mask-like. This serenity was the ultimate outward sign of their psychological success. They had managed to keep the chaotic world of perfect knowledge contained within the internal walls of the mnemonic palace. But the strain remains visible in the eyes that have seen too much and can forget nothing. The psychological toll was thus the price paid for the Jesuits' unique power. They achieved the strategic objective of total information control. But in doing so, they demonstrated the fundamental truth about knowledge. Absolute knowledge is an absolute burden. It strips away innocence, eliminates the possibility of hopeful ignorance, and forces the bearer into a cynical, isolating relationship with the rest of humanity. Their story is the ultimate cautionary tale for any institution or individual who seeks to control chaos by achieving perfect knowledge. The chaos of the world may be temporarily contained by such a system, but the chaos of the mind, deprived of the human capacity for oblivion, will ultimately turn inward, consuming the individual in a silent, perfect tragedy. The great cover-up was not only the secret chamber and the ciphered reports, but the perfect internal composure of the Jesuits themselves, the magnificent facade of serenity that concealed the internal psychological warfare being fought daily against the weight of all the world's secrets. We have now explored the human cost of the system. We must next examine the moral justification that allowed these brilliant, disciplined men to operate this cynical apparatus. Our journey continues with the exploration of the ultimate ethical conflict. As we turn our focus to the moral justification for total information control, every forbidden act requires an ultimate defense. For the Jesuit Order, the establishment of the perfect memory machina total global system of espionage and psychological profiling was justified by a single, terrifying principle: total information. Control is a moral necessity for the preservation of divine order. They did not view their actions as political intrigue, but as a superior form of spiritual stewardship. They argued that because the secular world was chaotic, fallen, and riddled with moral decay, a powerful, perfectly informed hand was required to steer it toward salvation. This doctrine was the core lie that masked their lust for power. It was the betrayal of trust wrapped in the velvet language of faith, allowing them to use the most intimate secrets of kings and commoners, gathered from the confessional and the classroom, not for prayer, but for strategic global leverage. They created a curse of cynicism, believing that because humanity was so flawed, only perfect knowledge could save it. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the cold, technical architecture of the memory palace to the warm, complex domain of philosophy and faith. This is where the true battle was fought, not in the courts of Europe, but in the minds of the Jesuit founders, where tactical ruthlessness was meticulously recategorized as spiritual virtue. To understand the moral justification, we must begin with the founding motto of the Society of Jesus, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God. This simple phrase, so noble and spiritually uplifting, was the ultimate ethical solvent, the intellectual tool used to dissolve conventional moral boundaries in the service of a higher, overriding goal. Ignatius Loyola, the military mind, instilled in his order the core belief that the Reformation was not a theological debate but an existential war for the soul of Europe. In war, one must use all available intelligence. and the Jesuit founders quickly realized that their spiritual mission-saving souls was fundamentally inseparable from their political mission, preserving the Catholic monarchies and institutions that house those souls. The justification for total information control flows directly from this premise of existential warfare. If the stakes are eternal salvation, then no means, so long as they are effective and ultimately successful, can be ethically disallowed. The logic proceeded in several distinct, chilling steps, formalized not in public doctrine, but in confidential internal memoranda. Step 1. The principle of informational responsibility. The Jesuits argued that failing to possess all available information was itself a moral failure. If a Jesuit agent, through negligence or misplaced delicacy, failed to collect a critical piece of intelligence, say, a king's secret financial distress, and that failure led to the king losing his throne to a Protestant rival, the Jesuits considered themselves morally complicit in the subsequent loss of those souls to heresy. Therefore, the thorough, total, and even intrusive collection of information was framed as a fundamental spiritual responsibility. Step 2. The chaos of the secular world. The Jesuit worldview posited that the rulers of the 16th and 17th centuries, the kings, nobles, and financiers, were inherently fallible, corruptible, and guided by short-term, selfish interests. They lacked the necessary long-term global perspective required to navigate the religious and political storms of the age. Because secular governance was chaotic and imperfect, it required the superior, enlightened guidance of an institution dedicated solely to God's will. The Jesuit Order, armed with its perfect knowledge, the information gathered through the perfect memory machine, the documented evidence of human weakness, was not seen as a tool for blackmail, but as a tool for necessary guidance. Leverage was merely the force required to apply the necessary pressure to an imperfect leva, the monarch, to achieve the perfect, divinely sanctioned outcome. This concept of necessary guidance led the Jesuits into the most ethically fraught territory of their justification, the distinction between the sacred seal of confession and the secular necessity of strategy. The confessional was arguably the single richest source of human intelligence in the world. Here, the Jesuit confessor received the most intimate, vulnerable secrets of the powerful, their sins, their doubts, their hidden political fears. The seal of confession was absolute. The specific contents of a sin could never be revealed, but the Jesuits found a terrifying analytical loophole. This loophole was the principle of functional synthesis. The Jesuit confessor, as a member of the memory elite, possessed the systematic ability to separate the spiritual content of the confession from the objective fact revealed therein, which he could then correlate with his vast codified internal data. For instance, he might learn in the confessional that a certain political figure is deeply consumed by avarice and has confessed to moving large sums of money. The sin itself is sealed, but the knowledge that this official is avaricious and suddenly controlling large, unrecorded cash flows is objective data. This objective data was then coded into a report not as a confession, but as a psychological profile update and transmitted back to the general. The justification was clear. The Jesuit was not revealing the sin. He was fulfilling his spiritual duty to protect the Church by informing the general of a confirmed, active political vulnerability in the environment. This distinction, while maintaining the letter of the seal, fundamentally violated its spirit, turning a sacred trust into an instrument of information. warfare. This subtle betrayal of trust was morally justified by the principle of the higher good teleology. The Jesuit argued, which is the greater good? Allowing a powerful, avaricious official to act unchecked, potentially damaging the church and leading thousands to spiritual ruin, or using the knowledge of his avarice to preempt his actions, guiding him through sophisticated leverage toward politically safe decisions? For the Jesuit mind, trained in military strategy and absolute obedience, the answer was unambiguous. The end goal, the preservation of the Catholic soul and structure, justified the manipulative means. The sin of the individual agent, the calculated leverage, was a lesser evil compared to the catastrophic evil of losing the war against heresy. This justification provided the intellectual armor necessary for the elite few to conduct their highly cynical operations with perfect composure and serenity. They weren't being cynical. They were being strategically moral. The Jesuit justification relied heavily on the concept of probabilism, a complex theological doctrine that gained prominence during this era, though not exclusively used by the Jesuits. While debates over its use were widespread, the Jesuit intelligence network took the strategic application of probabilism to a new, secularized level. Probabilism, at its simplest, suggested that when there were differing, conflicting theological opinions on a moral course of action, one could safely follow the less stringent or even the less probable opinion, provided it was supported by a respected authority. The Jesuit intelligence structure transformed this into an ethical tool for action. The logic applied to total information control became, if there is a plausible argument that using leverage derived from secret knowledge is necessary to prevent a greater political catastrophe, for example, the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, then the Jesuit operative is not only permitted to use that leverage, but is morally obligated to do so, provided the ultimate goal is the greater glory of God. The perfect memory system played a key role here. It allowed the Jesuits to argue that they possessed the most probable, most comprehensive, and most objective data set on which to base their ethical decision. They could look at the chaotic information of their rivals and assert that their own knowledge, being total and perfectly indexed, provided the highest moral clarity for action. Their perfect knowledge created their superior moral justification. This system effectively allowed the Jesuit General to become the supreme arbiter of strategic morality. All ethical dilemmas related to information control were funneled back to Rome, where the General, armed with the synthesis from the secret chamber, could issue decisions that appeared ruthless but were justified internally as the only rational, mathematically probable path to spiritual victory. This led to the moral dualism of the Jesuit life. Outwardly, the Jesuit preached simplicity, humility, and the importance of individual conscience. Inwardly, the memory elite operated according to a highly complex, strategic, and often coldly manipulative ethical code that prioritized the long-term, structural good of the Church over the individual short-term moral purity of the operative. The moral decay was not sudden corruption, but a gradual, institutional shift in the definition of virtue. A Jesuit could, with perfect sincerity, believe he was acting morally while deploying tactics that, to an outsider, looked exactly like political blackmail or cynical manipulation. The conviction that they were operating under a higher mandate was their shield against internal psychological dissonance. The Jesuit justification also found fertile ground in their application of the principle of casuistry, the resolution of specific, complex moral cases. While casuistry is an ancient method, the Jesuits excelled at it, often drawing criticism from those who saw their detailed examination of exceptions as moral license for the purpose of total information control. Casuistry provided the intellectual framework for dealing with the highly sensitive, ambiguous moral dilemmas encountered by the memory elite. For example, is it morally acceptable to allow an enemy to believe a deliberate half-truth about Jesuit strength? If the enemy, believing that half-truth, chooses a path that ultimately prevents a religious war? The Jesuit argument would be meticulously structured, yes. Because the ultimate goal is peace and the preservation of souls, and the act of deception is categorized as a strategic necessity, not a sin of malice, but an act of information defense. The complexity of their justification made it impenetrable to casual scrutiny, allowing their actions to be perceived as merely strange or overly subtle, rather than ruthlessly strategic. Furthermore, the Jesuits developed a concept known as mental reservation, the act of speaking a truth while simultaneously holding a secret, contradictory mental meaning. This was used to great effect when pressed by hostile authorities. If a king's agent asked a Jesuit if the order held any political secrets about the court, the Jesuit could truthfully say, "I hold no secrets of this court," while mentally reserving the truth that the secrets he held were not his personal secrets, but the property of the general superior filed in the collective. Standardized memory palace. The moral decay here is subtle but profound. The calculated erosion of the integrity of language itself. They learn to use truth as a technical weapon, relying on the precise interpretation of words while concealing the deeper strategic reality. The use of mental reservation was the ultimate defense of the secrets, a self-inflicted, continuous internal lie that preserved the external facade of innocence. The justification for this use of language was, once again, the defense of the mission. Since the outside world was deemed chaotic and potentially hostile to the divine cause, the Jesuit was morally permitted to employ tactical communication techniques to protect the order's ability to act. The ultimate loyalty was not to secular truth, but to strategic truth as defined by the Ad Majorem. DGLORIM. This intellectual environment fostered an internal culture where the elite few could operate without guilt. Their acts of deception, control, and profiling were not personal choices. They were disciplined obedience to a morally superior strategic architecture. The Jesuit reliance on total information control was also justified by the profound belief in the power of rational preemption. In the chaotic 16th and 17th centuries, many conflicts erupted from irrational decisions, emotional vanity, and a simple lack of complete information on the part of the rulers. The Jesuits saw themselves as the antidote to this chaos. They believed that by possessing perfect synthetic knowledge, they could intervene at critical, hidden junctures to guide events toward a rational, peaceful, and religiously sound conclusion, thereby preventing larger catastrophes. This meant the Jesuit agent was not a reactionary figure. He was an informational preemptor. He used his memory and his coded reports to predict where the next political fracture or military blunder would occur, and then quietly advised the monarch on the preemptive action necessary to avert the crisis. If a monarch was leaning toward a disastrous war, the Jesuit could subtly reveal a single, carefully chosen detail about the monarch's debt or a rival's secret strength, a detail gained from the perfect memory machine. That would rationally force the monarch to back down. The moral justification lay in the act of catastrophe prevention. It was deemed a profound act of charity to use sophisticated informational pressure to save a country from self-destruction. The discomfort or humiliation of the monarch, whose leverage was silently exposed, was seen as a minor necessary casualty in the greater spiritual war. This intellectual position allowed the Jesuits to operate with a cold, almost scientific detachment. They viewed the moral failings of the powerful not as subjects for emotional outrage, but as predictable stress points in the system that their perfect knowledge could effectively manage. Their cynicism was thus rationalized as analytical realism. This system further justified the secrecy of the secret chamber and the destruction of the manuals. If the world understood the mechanism of preemption, the vast, intimate knowledge, the Jesuits held it would lead to panic, persecution, and the utter destruction of their influence. Therefore, the secrecy itself became a moral imperative, necessary to preserve the system's operational viability and its ability to prevent global chaos. The cover-up was not to hide wrongdoing, but to protect the means of salvation. The constant tension was that this high-minded justification required the elite few to perform acts that were morally ambiguous on a daily basis. They had to perpetually lie, manipulate, and conceal, all while maintaining the absolute conviction that their actions were morally superior to the chaotic truth they sought to control. This intellectual juggling act was the final, defining psychological toll of their ethical system. Another powerful pillar of the Jesuit justification rested on the concept of the corporate body. The Jesuit viewed himself not as an isolated individual, but as a single, perfectly functioning limb of the larger, divinely sanctioned corporate body of the Society of Jesus. In this worldview, the moral obligation of the individual Jesuit was to serve the corporate whole, which was in turn serving the ad majorem Dei gloriam. This structural logic provided a profound justification for personal moral compromise. If an individual act of deception or an act of utilizing confidential information was commanded by the general superior, and if the general determined that this act was vital for the structural integrity of the corporate body, then the individual Jesuit could carry out the act with a clear conscience. His obedience was his virtue. The moral weight of the action rested entirely with the general and the collective. This mechanism was the ultimate defense against the psychological toll described earlier. It allowed the memory elite to carry the burden of the world's secrets and execute manipulative strategies without suffering crippling guilt. They were merely the perfect instruments of a morally superior strategic command. Their personal spiritual purity was maintained through absolute obedience. This concept fueled their obsession with information warfare because the information was not viewed as personal property, but as the collective nervous system of the corporate body. The total information control was necessary to ensure the body was healthy, responsive, and indestructible. However, this reliance on the corporate body created a profound danger of idolatry. The critics of the Jesuits often argued that the order had, in practice, elevated its own corporate preservation and strategic success above the authority of the Pope and the simple dictates of Scripture. The means, the sophisticated intelligence, the perfect memory, the manipulation had become so effective that they risked eclipsing the divine, and they were meant to serve. This was the ultimate accusation of moral decay, that the Jesuit Order had become so enamored with its own intellectual perfection and its informational superiority that the greater glory of God had been subtly replaced by the greater glory of the Society of Jesus. The Jesuit response was always calm and unwavering. Their perfect success proved their divine favor. Their ability to achieve outcomes that their rivals could not was the empirical evidence that their strategic morality was justified. Their system of total information control was simply the manifestation of God's blessing upon their discipline. The final, lasting impact of this moral justification is its legacy in the philosophical debate over ethical pragmatism. The Jesuits, in their pursuit of the ad majorem Dei gloriam, formalized a practical framework for prioritizing outcome over purity of method. They were, in a sense, the first great institution to organize and execute a global strategy based on cold, hard pragmatism. This is why the elite few were so carefully selected for their detachment. They were required to be the ultimate pragmatists, unburdened by the emotional noise of traditional morality. They had to be able to look at a king's political life and reduce it to a series of probabilities and vulnerabilities, justified solely by the potential benefit to the church. That the moral compromise was never random. It was always calculated and minimal. The Jesuits would use the least amount of leverage necessary, deploy the subtlest form of deception required, and use the least revealing form of coded communication possible. This was not a sign of virtue, but a sign of operational efficiency. They understood that excessive deception created instability and risked exposure. Their justification was, therefore, self-regulating. Their system of control demanded highly controlled, strategically moral behavior. We can see the reflection of this justification in the documents associated with the Papal Bulls that protected the order's secrecy. The argument made to the popes was simple. We alone have the structural integrity and the informational capacity to defend the Church in this modern era of chaos. You must grant us the necessary autonomy and secrecy to operate without external scrutiny, or the whole structure collapses. The popes themselves, immersed in the political chaos of the time, often recognized the terrifying truth in this assertion. They granted the bulls, thereby giving the moral justification the highest ecclesiastical sanction. The church hierarchy itself was forced to quietly accept the lie that the Jesuit intelligence operation was merely a complex form of spiritual defense. The final question remains: did the Jesuit founders truly believe in the superiority of their moral justification, or were they merely brilliantly rationalizing a desire for ultimate informational power? The answer lies in the deep internal psychological conviction of the elite few. They were the ones who had to live the contradiction, perfectly balancing the cold truth of their data with the fervent conviction of their faith. Their ability to do so without general psychological collapse testifies to the sheer power of the moral justification they were given. We are left with the profound, unsettling legacy of the moral justification for total information control. It is the concept that enabled the transformation of a small group of priests into a global shadow power. The justification acted as the spiritual engine, providing the necessary distance and conviction for the elite few to execute their demanding, morally fraught tasks. This justification is the reason the secrets were guarded with such ferocious dedication. The Jesuit Order was protecting not just a system of espionage, but a revolutionary and controversial ethical framework that allowed them to transcend traditional moral boundaries. If that framework had been publicly exposed, it would have been condemned as the ultimate act of moral decay and spiritual heresy. The quiet, hypnotic rhythm of this justification, the belief that the ultimate good requires temporary moral compromises, a philosophy that echoes through every major intelligence and power structure that has ever existed. The Jesuits simply formalized it, institutionalized it, and empowered it with a perfect system of total information control. The candle in the chamber burns low now, casting long shadows across the empty oak table. We have explored the necessity, the architecture, and the human cost of the Jesuit secret. We have seen how a strategic obsession was transformed into a spiritual imperative. The final step in understanding this deep history is to examine the specific tools they used to communicate their flawless intelligence, the language that bound the elite few across continents. Our journey continues with the methods they employed to protect their findings. As we turn our focus to the code used to transmit the perfect memories, the greatest forbidden knowledge held by the Jesuit Order was not the secrets they collected, but the perfect invisible method used to share them. This was the code used to transmit the perfect memories, a multi-layered cryptographic system that leveraged the standardized architecture of the human mind itself. A simple, innocuous letter filled with spiritual platitudes and reports of good. Health was, in reality, a devastating, high-speed information stream. The placement of a single word, the choice of a specific theological reference, or the mention of an ordinary object, a candle, a tapestry, a book acted as a cipher key, unlocking a vast, perfectly indexed data block within the recipient's perfect memory palace. This code was the ultimate betrayal of trust, turning friendly correspondence into military intelligence, securing the Order's absolute power by masking their global espionage in the guise of simple piety. The code was a continuous, invisible lie. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the psychological toll of the secret to the ingenious technical solution that allowed it to function across continents. We must now read between the lines, examining not what the Jesuit wrote, but how he wrote it, searching for the hidden rhythm and the specific, coded language that protected the integrity of their immense collective knowledge. The challenge faced by the Jesuit intelligence network was immense. They operated in an era of slow, unreliable, and highly vulnerable communication. Royal and papal mail services were routinely intercepted, read, and copied by rivals. How could the General Superior in Rome receive perfect, high-stakes intelligence from Manila, Paris, or Lima without risking total exposure? The answer lay in the mnemonic code, which utilized two distinct interlocking layers of encryption, accessible only to the elite few. This layer was a conventional cipher, often a numerical substitution or a homophonic code, used to protect the transmission of routine, though still sensitive, strategic information lists of potential donors, safe houses, or names of individuals under surveillance. Crucially, the key to this cipher was not static. It was often a phrase or a line of Latin poetry that was changed at regular intervals, but the new key was never sent physically. It was determined by a prearranged mathematical rule tied to a publicly known event, such as the date of a specific saint's day or the position of a specific star. This guaranteed that even if a ciphered letter was captured, the key would be useless within weeks. This was the truly revolutionary, forbidden layer of the system. It bypassed conventional encryption entirely and leveraged the shared internal architecture of the memory palace. This code was used to transmit the most critical, high-risk intelligence, the synthesized data derived from the psychological profiles and the secret chamber. The code relied on using specific, standardized reference points in ordinary prose. When an operative wrote a report to the general, they knew that certain words, when placed in certain contexts, would cease to function as simple language and become mnemonic triggers. For example, A Jesuit writing from the French court might include the phrase, "The king's chaplain spoke today of the beauty of the fourth tapestry in the royal chapel." To an interceptor, this is court gossip. To the Jesuit General, the mention of fourth tapestry is the coded trigger that instantly tells him, refer to the standardized symbol for France's relationship with the Protestant Dutch states filed in the fourth chamber of the Hall of Temporal Power, the subsequent words or numbers surrounding. The trigger word would then be the data update to that specific memory file, a simple number representing the debt status, or a brief phrase representing the current level of military risk. This method was brilliant because the content of the message was physically innocuous and seemingly natural, making detection virtually impossible without knowing the intimate, shared geography of the Jesuit mind. The precision of the mnemonic code meant that vast, complex amounts of information could be transmitted using minimal data, ensuring speed and efficiency. A sentence that took 10 seconds to write could convey a data synthesis that would take a conventional spy hundreds of words to report. This code was necessary because the information being transmitted was often deeply compromising, and the physical danger of carrying it was immense. Imagine a Jesuit traveling from Rome to Lisbon. He could carry a long, friendly letter full of seemingly theological updates and greetings, yet that single letter could contain a complete, up-to-the-minute status report on the Spanish monarchy's intentions regarding Portugal. The true secret was hidden in the rhythm and syntax of the prose itself. The code was also used for interoperative communication, the Jesuits talking among themselves without routing the information through Rome, a necessary practice for local coordination. If two Jesuits met in a neutral city, their conversation would be a seamless blend of ordinary speech and mnemonic references. One might mention, "I pray that the West Wing gardens remain fertile this year," which, to the other, meant, "I am worried about the stability of the economic situation in the New World colonies." The subtle moral corruption of this code lies in its perfect duplicity. It institutionalized the lie that the Jesuit was only a simple man of God. Every conversation, every correspondence, and every public speech by a member of the elite few was potentially a coded intelligence transmission. The Jesuit learned to speak not only with his mouth, but with the perfectly coded architecture of his mind, eroding the concept of genuine, transparent communication. The code's success created the Jesuit Order's enduring image, the man who is calm, intelligent, and speaks little, but whose words carry immense, inexplicable weight. His brevity was not humility. It was data compression. His calm was not piety. It was the perfect internal processing of total intelligence. The maintenance of this shared internal code required constant, secret communication between the general and the elite few to ensure synchronization. New symbols had to be introduced to account for new political entities, new financial methods, or new heresies. The general would send out periodic, highly protected updates, often disguised as theological circulars that contained the hidden instructions for updating the architecture and the symbolic meanings within the palace. This system was protected by the oath of absolute silence regarding the code's mechanism. Since the code existed only as a shared internal framework, revealing the technique would instantly disable the entire global network. The knowledge of the code was, literally, life-or-death information warfare. The search by rival powers for the Jesuits' master cipher key was a sustained failure precisely because of this unique methodology. When royal agents intercepted and analyzed Jesuit correspondence, they found complex conventional ciphers that were eventually broken, but these only revealed low to mid-level strategic information. The core high-risk intelligence was never found because it was hidden in plain sight, encoded not in substitution, but in contextual meaning accessible only to the trained Jesuit mind. The enemy was searching for a document, a book, or a mechanical device. The Jesuits had hidden their code in the most secure place possible. The human mind itself, the final brilliance of the mnemonic code, was its self-destruct mechanism. If a Jesuit operative was captured, his last act was to mentally corrupt the symbols within his mnemonic palace, often by deliberately associating crucial symbols with nonsensical images or false emotional responses. This made any interrogation based on torture or truth serum useless. Even if the operative spoke the words, the underlying data would be corrupted, and the symbols he revealed would be worthless to the enemy attempting to reconstruct the network, the code, used to transmit the perfect memories was. Therefore, the final, perfect expression of Ignatius's military genius, a system that was mobile, invisible, universally present, and self-defending. It transformed language into the ultimate weapon of information warfare. The shadows deepen now. We have traced the mechanism that allowed the secrets to flow with perfect precision. We have seen how mere words, framed by the cold architecture of the mind, became the language of power. We have explored the code. Now, we must examine the formal protection granted to this dangerous enterprise. Our journey continues with the supreme authority that shielded this operation. As we turn our focus to the Papal Bulls that protected the Order's secrecy, the Jesuits' ultimate tool of power, the perfect memory palace, was simultaneously their greatest, deepest curse. This meticulously constructed internal world, which contained every political secret and every documented instance of moral decay, was subject to a single catastrophic vulnerability: madness. The sheer, unceasing weight of perfect, unblinking knowledge of global deceit and betrayal risked the structural collapse of the operative's mind. If the memory palace crumbled, the internal chaos would not only destroy the Jesuit, but instantly compromise the entire network, leaking decades of forbidden intelligence to the world. This was the terrifying hidden cost of total information control, a psychological betrayal inherent in the system's design. The Jesuits had solved the problem of human forgetfulness, only to unleash the lie that the mind could endure endless. Perfect truth without breaking. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the flawless, external execution of Jesuit strategy to the dark, chaotic landscape of the individual mind. This is where the true pressure resided, the point where the pursuit of perfection met the frail limits of the human psyche. We must examine the signs of strain, the subtle tremors that signaled the imminent collapse of the ultimate internal archive, the fear of the memory. Palace collapsing into madness was the paramount operational risk for the Jesuit General. The collective memory was an asset of incredible value, but unlike a physical archive, it could be destroyed instantly by internal psychological failure. The risk arose from a fundamental conflict: the human mind's need for oblivion versus the Jesuit system's demand for perpetual recall. The elite few were trained to build an artificial, perfectly ordered internal world, the palace. But this palace was built over the natural, organic memory, which contained the chaos and emotion of personal experience. The first sign of the impending collapse was often informational bleed. This occurred when the perfectly indexed, impersonal data from the memory palace began to bleed into the Jesuits' personal, emotional reality. For instance, a Jesuit might be advising a powerful noble. In his mind, the symbol for this noble is leverage point 3, avarice. If the palace began to collapse, the Jesuit would lose the critical boundary between the symbolic data and the man himself. He would start to genuinely perceive the noble not as a complex human being, but as a two-dimensional, predictable variable, a walking symbol of avarice. This led to the severe, crippling symptom of paranoid detachment. The operative would begin to view all external reality as a perfectly coded, cynical machine. Every friendly gesture became a calculated move. Every innocent conversation became a veiled threat. Because his memory was perfect, he could instantly recall every historical example of similar deceit, reinforcing the terrifying belief that genuine innocence was simply an informational failure on his part. He could no longer experience simple trust, trapping him in a prison of cynical, absolute knowledge. The organizational fear was that this paranoia would lead to operational compromise. A Jesuit consumed by madness might, in a fit of delusion, mistakenly use the wrong coded language, or worse, deliberately leak a mixture of truths and falsehoods, a form of sabotage that could lead to catastrophic strategic blunders, such as collapsing a stable monarchy or exposing a network of agents. The integrity of the information was as fragile as the sanity of the man who held it. The Jesuit generals instituted rigorous, covert protocols to monitor their elite few for the earliest signs of psychological fatigue. These protocols were conducted during the mandatory, secret communication periods when the operatives reported back to Rome or to a regional superior. The monitoring was not done through direct questioning about sanity, but through informational stress tests. The superior would intentionally introduce small, seemingly trivial contradictions into the conversation: an inaccurate date, a slight misrepresentation of a coded symbol, or a false detail about a distant political event. The sane, disciplined operative would instantly detect and correct the error with calm precision, referencing his palace effortlessly. The operative whose palace was beginning to collapse, however, would exhibit a subtle, terrifying hesitation. He might take too long to retrieve the information, or worse, he might become emotionally defensive or aggressively suspicious, reacting to the stress as if the error was a personal attack rather than a technical test. This test revealed the health of the moral buffer. When the buffer was strong, the external chaos was processed as cold data. When the palace was faltering, the data became saturated with personal fear and paranoia, triggering an emotional response. The Jesuit term for this condition was often whispered as the shadow of Porphyry, a metaphorical reference to the stone of emperors, suggesting a madness born of too much power and too much knowledge. The spiritual remedy was intensified absolute obedience and renewed isolation in the spiritual exercises, forcing the mind back into the rigorous controlling architecture of the palace. But for the severest cases, those who had crossed the threshold into mnemonic delusion, a final, chilling protocol was enacted: the containment of the archive. This protocol acknowledged that the man was lost, but the secrets he carried were not. The afflicted Jesuit was quietly, immediately recalled to a secluded, non-operational residence, often a small, isolated farm or a silent cell on the outskirts of Rome. His superiors ensured he was cut off from all sources of new information, political news, and contact with other members of the order. The goal was to freeze the archive in its current, corrupted state. The man lived out his life in comfort, but in total, deliberate informational stasis, a living, guarded tomb for the world's secrets. This was the ultimate act of moral decay and betrayal, sacrificing the human being to preserve the integrity of the data he carried. The fear of collapse influenced Jesuit architecture and policy globally. The general insisted on an obsessive emphasis on routine and ritual within the order. This was not only for spiritual discipline, but to provide a solid, predictable external framework that countered the chaotic, unpredictable internal world of the memory palace. Every hour, every meal, every prayer was standardized, providing an anchor against the internal vertigo of perfect knowledge. The psychological toll was a powerful reminder of the forbidden nature of their achievement. The Jesuits had sought a form of godlike omniscience, the ability to know everything perfectly. But the perfect human mind, in attempting to hold that knowledge, revealed its own fragility. The madness was the mind's violent, last-ditch attempt to forget the overwhelming truth, the lesson of the collapsing palace is the persistent danger of absolute information. It suggests that the human capacity for error, doubt, and oblivion is not a weakness, but a necessary safeguard for sanity. The pursuit of informational perfection, divorced from human frailty, leads not to supreme control, but to catastrophic internal chaos. The flickering light now illuminates the silence. We have looked into the terrible strain placed upon the men who were the ultimate keepers of the Jesuit secret. Their fear was not of physical death, but of the internal explosion of truth. We have seen the peril they faced. Now, we must examine the ultimate power they were trying to prevent from falling into rival hands. Our journey continues with the formal authority that shielded this operation, as we turn our focus to the Papal Bulls that protected the order's secrecy. The most sophisticated library in Europe was not built of stone, but of flesh and blood. The Jesuits, as living, breathing libraries of forbidden knowledge, were the ultimate expression of the order's betrayal of scholarly tradition. They intentionally avoided committing the most damning secrets to paper, choosing instead to house the complete, coded history of Europe's moral decay within the perfectly trained minds of their elite few. Each operative was a moving, decentralized archive of Forbidden's library containing the cipher keys, the political vulnerabilities, and the financial secrets of every major court. This was the core lie of the Jesuit structure. Their archives were clean because the true, cursed knowledge was perfectly internalized, making them immune to raid, theft, or conventional discovery. They were walking proof that the greatest repository of power could be completely invisible. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We must contemplate the silence of the Jesuits, a silence that was not empty, but filled with the constant, quiet hum of vast, perfectly indexed data. These were men whose identity was subsumed by their knowledge, becoming the most powerful, dangerous, and secret repositories of information the world had ever known. The concept of the living library was a direct solution to the security problems of the 16th and 17th centuries. In an era of political instability, printing presses, and routine espionage, any document containing high-value political secrets was a massive liability. Ignatius and his successors realized that the most secure container for information was not a vault, but a highly disciplined, perfectly trained human mind. The Jesuits, as living libraries, were the result of the memory implantation process. Each Jesuit of the elite few carried within him the entire standardized architecture of the mnemonic palace, a shared mental blueprint that ensured their memories were cross-compatible and centrally indexable. Consider the practical advantage. A conventional library is static. A Jesuit operative is mobile. A document can be stolen, copied, or burned. The Jesuit's memory can only be corrupted by his own madness, and even then, the protocols for isolation were designed to neutralize the threat. The information, therefore, existed in a permanent state of high security, distributed across the globe, yet instantly accessible and updatable through the mnemonic code. This internal library contained multiple distinct, specialized collections of forbidden knowledge. 1. The psychological archives. This collection housed the meticulously profiled weaknesses, debts, and fears of thousands of key political, religious, and financial figures. It was the perfect index of human moral decay. 2. The financial archives. This contained the detailed, unrecorded flows of gold, silver, and credit related to the order's vast network, revealing which monarchs were solvent, which were desperately indebted, and who could therefore be controlled through the withdrawal of funds. 3. The theological archives, the heresy index. This was a constantly updated, deep dive into the specific philosophical and political weaknesses of every Protestant sect and intellectual rival, allowing the Jesuits to target their counter-propaganda and political pressure with surgical precision. By carrying this data internally, the Jesuit operative transformed every interaction into an archival retrieval. When speaking to a diplomat, the Jesuit was not relying on memory fragments. He was instantly accessing the perfectly indexed file on that man's history, vulnerabilities, and current strategic position, granting him an unnerving edge in every negotiation. The distinction between the living library and a conventional spy network lies in the concept of synthesis. A spy network collects raw data. The Jesuits carried processed, synthesized information. The mnemonic palace was not merely a storage container. It was a perfect, internal cross-referencing engine. When a report of a new financial scandal arrived in the mind of a memory elite operative, it was instantly and automatically cross-referenced with the archive psychological profile of the involved parties, the current state of the global gold flow, and the order's overarching strategic goal. The Jesuit never had to pause to look up a fact. The relevant truth simply appeared, perfectly formed and strategically contextualized. This automated synthesis allowed the Jesuit to operate with an air of miraculous foresight. His advice was always timely, always accurate, and always seemed to anticipate problems that others had not yet seen. This was not a miracle. It was the chilling efficiency of the living library, where chaos was immediately converted into perfect, actionable knowledge. The moral compromise embedded in this system was the profound depersonalization of human experience. The individual Jesuit had to view himself not as a person, but as a tool of pure information. His memories, his knowledge, his internal life, it all belonged to the order. He was a perfect storage device, which allowed the order to shed the responsibility of physical archives and the liability of paper trails. The danger of this perfect system was that it created an ultimate temptation, the temptation to use this total knowledge for total control. The Jesuit justification argued that this control was benign and necessary. But the reality was that the power inherent in the living library was inherently corrupting, placing the order in a position of ultimate informational superiority over the entire political and religious world. The reliance on the living library also meant that the elite Few were constantly under immense psychological strain. They were the most valuable assets of the order, and their minds were the only place where the most dangerous secrets resided. Every illness, every fever, every moment of mental fatigue in a memory elite operative was a systemic risk, alert for the general superior in Rome. The health of the individual was not a personal concern. It was a security metric tied directly to the integrity of the most powerful secret archive in existence. The ultimate test of the living library came during the suppression of the Jesuit Order in 1773, when the police and royal agents stormed the colleges. They seized books and documents, but the core forbidden knowledge was never found. It had already scattered with the banished Jesuits, held safe within their silent, disciplined minds. The archive had simply dissolved into the population. Beyond the reach of any decree or army, the agents searched for books detailing the conspiracy. Instead, the Jesuits themselves were the books. They were the walking, breathing, perfect testimony to the order's mastery of information warfare and their commitment to the most secure form of storage imaginable. We are left with the quiet realization that the most dangerous secrets in history are rarely those written on crumbling parchment. They are those written and perfected within the human mind. The shadows deepen now, wrapping around the image of these silent, walking libraries. We have seen how the men were transformed into perfect vessels for the secret. Now, we must examine the formal protection granted to this dangerous enterprise. Our journey continues with the supreme authority that shielded this operation. As we turn our focus to the Papal Bulls that protected the order's secrecy, the most sophisticated library in Europe was not built of stone, but of flesh and blood. The Jesuits as living, breathing libraries of forbidden knowledge were the ultimate expression of the order's betrayal of scholarly tradition. They intentionally avoided committing the most damning secrets to paper, choosing instead to house the complete, coded history of Europe's moral decay within the perfectly trained minds of their elite few. Each operative was a moving, decentralized archive of Forbidden's library containing the cipher keys, the political vulnerabilities, and the financial secrets of every major court. This was the core lie of the Jesuit structure. Their archives were clean because the true, cursed knowledge was perfectly internalized, making them immune to raid, theft, or conventional discovery. They were walking proof that the greatest repository of power could be completely invisible. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We must contemplate the silence of the Jesuits, a silence that was not empty, but filled with the constant, quiet hum of vast, perfectly indexed data. These were men whose identity was subsumed by their knowledge, becoming the most powerful, dangerous, and secret repositories of information the world had ever known. The concept of the living library was a direct solution to the security problems of the 16th and 17th centuries. In an era of political instability, printing presses, and routine espionage, any document containing high-value political secrets was a massive liability. Ignatius and his successors realized that the most secure container for information was not a vault, but a highly disciplined, perfectly trained human mind. This understanding was the genesis of the ultimate psychological cover-up. The Jesuits as living libraries were the result of the memory implantation process. Each Jesuit of the elite few carried within him the entire standardized architecture of the mnemonic palace, shared mental blueprint that ensured their memories were cross-compatible. And centrally indexable, consider the practical advantage. A conventional library is static. A Jesuit operative is mobile. A document can be stolen, copied, or burned. The Jesuit's memory can only be corrupted by his own madness. And even then, the protocols for isolation were designed to neutralize the threat. The information, therefore, existed in a permanent state of high security, distributed across the globe, yet instantly accessible and updatable through the mnemonic code. This continuous state of internal vigilance and readiness was the price of perfect security. This internal library contained multiple distinct, specialized collections of forbidden knowledge. 1. The Psychological Archives. This collection housed the meticulously profiled weaknesses, debts, and fears of thousands of key political, religious, and financial figures. It was the perfect index of human moral decay. The precision of this internal profiling gave the Jesuit a mastery over political outcomes, unmatched by any contemporary ruler. 2. The Financial Archives. This contained the detailed, unrecorded flows of gold, silver, and credit related to the order's vast network, revealing which monarchs were solvent, which were desperately indebted, and who could therefore be controlled through the withdrawal of funds. 3. The Theological Archives, the Heresy Index. This was a constantly updated, deep dive into the specific philosophical and political weaknesses of every Protestant sect and intellectual rival, allowing the Jesuits to target their counter-propaganda and political pressure with surgical precision. By carrying this data internally, the Jesuit operative transformed every interaction into an archival retrieval. When speaking to a diplomat, the Jesuit was not relying on memory fragments. He was instantly accessing the perfectly indexed file on that man's history, vulnerabilities, and current strategic position, granting him an unnerving edge in every negotiation. The greatest forbidden operation in Europe required the ultimate defense, official protection from the highest spiritual authority. This defense was granted through the Papal Bulls that protected the order's secrecy documents that appeared to be standard ecclesiastical privileges but were, in reality, the legal cover-up for a vast, unsanctioned intelligence network. These secret bulls gave the Jesuit General absolute, unchecked power over his own members, insulating the elite few and their perfect memory machine from external investigation even by the Vatican itself. This was the core betrayal. The highest spiritual office was manipulated, willingly or unwillingly, into becoming the legal shield for an operation built on global espionage and the documented moral decay of kings and cardinals. The parchment itself was a lie, hiding a curse of political maneuvering beneath the seal of God. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman College. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We drift now to the heart of Rome, seeking the silent exchange of power between the ambitious, global general of the Jesuits and the cautious, often vulnerable Pope. We must read the language of authority, examining how the legal stamp of the Church was transformed into the ultimate firewall protecting a massive, clandestine enterprise. A papal bull, a formal document issued by the Pope, carries the absolute weight of spiritual and legal authority in the Catholic world. The Jesuits, founded in 1540 by Ignatius Loyola, rapidly accumulated many such bulls, establishing their colleges, confirming their structure, and defining their missionary mandates. But hidden within the standard grants of privilege were specific clauses, inserted by Jesuit diplomacy and strategic request, that were essential for the security of the total information control system. The core problem for the Jesuits was jurisdiction. If a secular ruler or a local bishop suspected a Jesuit of espionage or of collecting politically sensitive secrets, they would appeal to the Pope for the right to investigate, arrest, and interrogate the individual. Such an investigation, if allowed to proceed unhindered, would quickly uncover the standardized mnemonic system and the existence of the elite few. The entire network would crumble. The Jesuit General's strategy was brilliant. Secure papal documents that systematically exempted the society from external jurisdiction in matters of internal discipline and personnel. These bulls effectively created a sovereign immunity for the order, allowing them to police themselves without oversight. The most critical secret bulls were those that gave the General Superior absolute authority over the vows and movement of his members. This meant that if a Jesuit operative began to show signs of mnemonic delusion or was under external suspicion, the general could instantly recall him, reassign him to an isolated posting, or place him in confinement, all without needing to explain the reason or justify the action to the local bishop, the king, or even other cardinals. The general would present this as necessary for spiritual purity and organizational efficiency, a demand for the military discipline required to fight heresy. The Pope, recognizing the Jesuits as the Church's most effective weapon against Protestantism, usually granted the requests, perhaps unaware that he was signing the legal protection for a sophisticated global intelligence system dedicated to political leverage. These bulls served as the final absolute legal cover-up. They rendered the elite few untouchable. The king could not force an interrogation without directly challenging the authority of the papacy, a political risk few monarchs were willing to take lightly. The documents themselves were the ultimate demonstration of how spiritual authority could be harnessed to protect temporal and often cynical power. The protection offered by the Papal Bulls extended directly to the integrity of the information itself, particularly the contents of the secret chamber. Rivals often argued that the Jesuits, due to their involvement in royal courts and finance, should be subject to public audits and inspections, particularly of their archives. The bulls often contained sweeping clauses regarding the order's right to maintain confidential records concerning the administration of its colleges and missions. While these clauses were ostensibly about legal and financial administration, the Jesuits leveraged them to block all attempts to inspect the documents related to their information gathering. The argument was simple. The information gathered through their vast global network was vital to the apostolic mission and must be kept absolutely confidential to ensure the safety of missionaries and the success of the Catholic cause. The secular and even ecclesiastical world had to trust the Jesuit General to be the sole, responsible custodian of that sensitive intelligence. This was the subtle light that they were protecting souls. When they were equally protecting their global leverage map, the fact that the Pope granted these bulls was itself the greatest moral compromise of the highest authority. The popes were often heavily reliant on the Jesuits for reliable, actionable intelligence about the state of Europe, information often gathered through the very forbidden methods they were protecting. The Pope needed the intelligence. Therefore, he had to protect the mechanism that produced it. This created a vicious circle of complicity. The papacy protected the Jesuit secrecy, thereby enabling the continued acquisition of strategic secrets, which in turn made the papacy more dependent on the Jesuits for information, necessitating further protection. The moral decay was institutional, spreading from the strategic mind of the general to the legal seal of the papal curia. The elite Few carried the knowledge of this legal protection as a mental shield. They knew that even if they were arrested by a king's guard, their ultimate fate was dictated by Rome, and Rome was legally obligated to protect them due to the Bulls. This legal immunity allowed them to operate with a degree of cool detachment and calculated risk-taking that no other agents in Europe possessed. The documents themselves, written in formal Latin, sealed with leaden bulla, were tangible proof that the greatest espionage operation of the age was not merely tolerated, but legally sanctioned by the spiritual head of Western Christendom. The long-term impact of the Papal Bulls was to fuel the intense resentment felt by European monarchs and rival religious orders. They saw the Bulls not as protection for a spiritual mission, but as legal proof of the Jesuits' arrogance and their claim to a dual sovereignty, one spiritual, one informational, that placed them above the law of the land. This legal immunity was ultimately the reason the Jesuits were suppressed centuries later. The kings realized that to destroy the Jesuit network, they could not fight the order itself. They had to directly challenge the Pope and force him to revoke the bulls, which they did in 1773. The legal defense was absolute, but the political cost became too high. We are left with the final heavy image of these documents, crumbling parchment and lead seals, which once held the power to shield a forbidden global intelligence machine. They stand as a silent testament to the ultimate act of cover-up, the use of sacred law to protect secular, strategic power. The light fades now. We have seen the political and legal defense of the Jesuit secret. Now we must examine the final, most devastating act of preservation, the destruction of the tangible evidence itself. Our journey continues with the ultimate act of operational security, as we turn our focus to the systematic destruction of the training manuals. The most damning evidence of the Jesuits' forbidden intelligence system was destroyed not once, but continuously over 2 centuries. This was the systematic destruction of the training manuals and internal protocol that mandated the burning of every physical blueprint, detailing the perfect memory palace and its coded symbols. These manuals, which contained the keys to the entire global espionage network, were never bound, never cataloged, and never meant to survive the students' training. This continuous incineration was the ultimate cover-up and the absolute proof of the Order's commitment to the lie of information security. By destroying the paper, they ensured the cursed knowledge only existed in the minds of the elite few, making the conspiracy untouchable. This protocol was the ultimate betrayal of the archival tradition, favoring absolute operational security over historical record. This is the truth the king buried, whispered only in the deepest cells of the Roman college. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the legal protection of the Pope to the quiet internal discipline of the Jesuit novitiate. We search for the evidence of a secret erased the moment the knowledge passed from paper to mind, and the paper itself was ritualistically consumed by fire. This quiet destruction was the heart of the Jesuits' strategic genius. In the Jesuit Order, knowledge was viewed through a strategic military lens. Information that can be captured is a liability. Information that exists only in the mind is an asset. The training manuals were the crucial, vulnerable bridge between the Order's secret methodology and the elite few chosen to carry the system. These manuals were unlike standard textbooks. They were not mass-printed. They were hand-copied, often by the novice himself, under the strict supervision of his instructor. They contained the precise, meticulous instructions for constructing the standardized mnemonic palace, the blueprint for the placement of the halls of power, the chamber of financial flows, and the specific symbols assigned to every political and theological entity. The knowledge contained within these fragile, temporary folios was the most dangerous material in the entire order. If even one complete manual were to fall into the hands of a hostile power, a king's agent, or a rival Protestant theologian, the entire mnemonic code would be reverse engineered, and the global intelligence network would be instantly neutralized. Therefore, the systematic destruction of the training manuals was not an occasional security measure, but a mandatory ritual built into the pedagogical process. The rule was simple and absolute. The training folio must be incinerated at the very moment the novice demonstrated perfect internalization and flawless recall of the palace architecture. The ceremony of destruction was a profound psychological commitment. The novice would be led to a small, private, soundproofed room, often an extension of the secret chamber, where, under the watchful eye of his instructor, he would personally commit the paper to the flames. He watched the physical, tangible key to the world's most powerful secret turn to ash. This act served two critical purposes. 1. Operational security. It guaranteed that no permanent paper trail existed for the core methodology of the system. 2. Psychological implantation. It cemented in the novice's mind the understanding that the knowledge was now his alone, a truth so dangerous it could not exist in the physical world. The memory was now perfectly secured in the only container deemed safe, his highly disciplined mind. This protocol was the ultimate act of moral decay toward historical transparency, favoring clandestine operational success over any responsibility to record the means of their power. The rigorous adherence to this destruction protocol explains the historical frustration of the Jesuit Order's enemies. In the centuries leading up to the suppression, countless spies and investigators searched the Jesuit libraries and archives for the master key to their power. They looked for volumes of complex ciphers or military strategy, but they found only the vast, immaculate collections of theology and scholarship. The public sanctioned facade, the documents that held the true forbiddance, knowledge, the architectural blueprints for the mind were never there. They had been reduced to ash decades before. The only physical records that did survive were fragments, incomplete, general, or purposefully misleading preparatory notes, which were useless without the full, standardized key that lived only within the living libraries. The Jesuit General's office had to maintain a precise, silent record of who had been trained and who had successfully burned the evidence. This list of names, the elite few, was the Order's most closely guarded document, far more valuable than any financial ledger. The names themselves were the index to the global archive. The systematic destruction was extended to all related materials. Any temporary notes used by the instructors, any diagrams sketched on wax tablets during the training, or any loose papers detailing symbolic updates were required to be destroyed daily. The Jesuit philosophy demanded an absolute austerity of material proof where secrets were concerned. This was the final layer of the lie that the Jesuits maintained. Their power was purely spiritual and intellectual, derived from discipline and piety. The destruction of the manuals obscured the fact that their power was, in reality, derived from a highly engineered, standardized, and cynical psychological technology. The spiritual rationale for the destruction was framed as humility, that the knowledge was too sublime to be contained in mere paper. The operational reality was absolute security. The men were forced to internalize the secret so completely that they became the only extant copy of the most sensitive, Operational manual in the world. This continuous act of erasure was one of the most effective and quiet cover-ups in history. The physical absence of the manuals created a profound vacuum in the historical record, ensuring that the true nature of the Jesuit intelligence system could only be surmised through the actions of the elite few, never through verifiable documentation. As we close this chapter, we reflect on the ultimate power of erasure. The Jesuits understood that control is maintained not only by what you know, but by what you prevent others from knowing and what you prevent from being recorded. The act of turning the most powerful operational manual in the world into ash was the final, definitive commitment to absolute secrecy. The fire of the brazier consumed the paper, but it also cemented the knowledge within the minds of the elite few. The memory became permanent, and the secret became untouchable. This single, quiet protocol allowed the entire, sprawling espionage apparatus to exist without leaving behind the physical evidence of its means. The shadows deepen now. We have witnessed the ultimate security measure that protected the Jesuit secret from their enemies. We have seen the systematic destruction of the means of training. Now we must examine the final, lingering question: the ultimate fate and responsibility of the men who carried this unwritten, perfect knowledge. Our journey continues with the final resolution of the collective secret, as we turn our focus to the final resting place of the gears and springs.